Welcome to the world of the French Revolution. Tonight, we embark on a journey through one of history's most turbulent and transformative eras, from the thunderous roar of the Bastille to the rise of Napoleon. Now, settle in, get cozy, perhaps adjust your favorite cushion, let your shoulders soften, and breathe deep. We're not going anywhere fast, so find that perfect spot where you feel most relaxed, most at ease. I wonder where you are joining us from tonight. Is it a cozy nook, a quiet corner? And what time is it for you? Is it a peaceful evening or perhaps a surprisingly bright morning in your perfectly chaotic schedule? Wherever and whenever you are, I'm glad you're here. If this journey through history speaks to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss our future explorations. Imagine, if you will, a time when the air itself seemed to hum with a different kind of energy, a subtle shift that was about to become a seismic event. And we begin with the whispers of discontent, the grumbles of a nation ready for change. The France of the late 1780s existed as a nation built on layers of tradition, a structure so deeply ingrained that questioning it felt akin to questioning the very air one breathed. For centuries, society had been meticulously divided into three distinct groups, called estates. The first estate comprised the clergy, holding significant land and spiritual authority, while the second estate was the nobility, also possessing vast estates and enjoying numerous inherited privileges, most notably exemption from many taxes. Then there was the third estate, a broad category encompassing everyone else, from wealthy merchants and lawyers to the farmers toiling the land and the laborers in burgeoning towns, representing the overwhelming majority of the populace. This arrangement meant that the financial burdens of the kingdom fell most heavily upon those least able to bear them. The kingdom's coffers had been steadily depleted over generations, a consequence of costly military engagements, including substantial support for the American colonies in their bid for independence, and the often extravagant spending habits of the royal court. These expenditures, coupled with a system that allowed the wealthiest estates to contribute little, created a persistent deficit that the monarchy struggled to manage. The materials of governance were therefore strained. The existing administrative and financial systems were aged, rigid, and ill-equipped to handle the growing economic pressures or the evolving needs of the population. It was as if trying to mend a sail with thread that was too brittle, a task destined for failure. The organization of labor across the land further contributed to the widespread hardship. Many rural workers remained bound by remnants of feudal obligations, duties and payments owed to local lords that restricted their freedom and limited the efficiency of their farming. This system, a relic of a bygone era, stifled innovation and meant that a large portion of the fruits of their toil was siphoned away, leaving little for their own families. Even in the towns where early industries were beginning to develop, guilds and traditional practices often limited growth and the adoption of more effective methods. These entrenched structures presented significant challenges to any attempt at economic reform or even basic fairness. Within this framework, the king, Louis XVI, faced an increasingly desperate financial situation. His ministers proposed various tax reforms, often targeting the privileged estates, but these efforts met with stiff resistance from those who benefited from the existing system. The ingrained privileges of the nobility and clergy, protected by custom and law, proved to be formidable obstacles. Historical accounts reveal the constant struggle of royal ministers attempting to gain acceptance for new taxation schemes, only to be thwarted by the entrenched powers of the aristocracy, who held considerable sway over royal policy through their influence at court and their representation in various advisory councils. The very materials available for administration were rooted in this deeply hierarchical past. Royal pronouncements, judicial procedures, and tax collection methods all reflected a society where birthright and status trumped merit or need. This created a disconnect between the ruling class and the ruled, with a governing philosophy that struggled to adapt to the changing economic realities and the growing discontent among the common people. The kingdom's finances were a testament to this systemic weakness. A constant struggle for resources meant that public works often languished and essential services were underfunded, further exacerbating the public's grievances. This administrative inertia meant that the kingdom's labor was not always directed towards the most productive ends. The inherited rights and duties associated with land ownership, for instance, meant that agricultural practices could be slow to change, and peasants might be obligated to perform certain tasks for their lord rather than focus on their own immediate needs or potential improvements. This lack of flexibility in the labor organization of the nation contributed to economic stagnation in many regions, making the populace more vulnerable to poor harvests and rising prices. The kingdom functioned more like a well-worn machine with creaking gears than a dynamic entity. Indeed, the challenges facing the crown were not merely financial, but systemic. The inability to enact meaningful reform without fundamentally altering the power structures of the first two estates created a perpetual deadlock. The crown was caught between its need for revenue and its dependence on the very classes that resisted contributing fairly. This created a palpable tension, a sense that the kingdom was being held captive by its own history, its potential for progress hobbled by the weight of inherited privilege and outdated practices. The system, while familiar, was proving increasingly unsustainable. The royal attempts at fiscal reform, such as those championed by ministers like Cologne and Brienne, illustrate this struggle vividly. They proposed plans to tax all landowners, regardless of estate, in an effort to balance the budget. However, these proposals were met with immediate and unified opposition from the nobility and clergy, who convened their own assemblies to reject the reforms. This opposition, grounded in their traditional rights and privileges, effectively paralyzed the government's ability to address the burgeoning crisis, demonstrating how deeply entrenched these ancient materials of power were. The financial strain also impacted the practicalities of daily life for many. Taxes like the gabelle, a salt tax that varied wildly from region to region, created significant hardship and smuggling operations. Merchants and farmers alike had to navigate a complex web of regulations and imposts that hindered trade and increased the cost of basic necessities. The kingdom's economic life was thus characterized by inefficiencies and inequalities, all stemming from the fundamental structure of the Ancien Régime, the Old Order. This made widespread prosperity difficult to achieve. The sheer weight of tradition meant that the labor organization in the administration itself was often inefficient. Positions were frequently bought or inherited, leading to a bureaucracy filled with individuals who lacked the necessary skills or motivation to effectively govern. This added another layer of complication when trying to implement new policies or collect taxes efficiently. The kingdom's resources were often diverted or wasted due to this ingrained system of patronage and privilege, a problem that eluded simple solutions. The kingdom's financial structure, then, was not merely a matter of accounting, but a reflection of its deepest societal divisions. The materials of wealth, land, titles, and privileges, were concentrated in the hands of a few, while the labor of the vast majority provided the kingdom's actual economic output. This imbalance was a constant source of friction, a simmering discontent that, while not yet erupting into open revolt, was steadily eroding the foundations of royal authority and the established social order. It was a delicate balance, one that was beginning to fray. The persistent challenges of this system were not lost on everyone. While many in the privileged estates remained content with their advantages, a growing number of individuals, even within those ranks, began to recognize the inherent unfairness and the growing instability it produced. Whispers of change, though quiet at first, were circulating through salons and correspondence, hinting at a need for a more equitable distribution of burdens and a more rational system of governance, a seed of doubt planted in the minds of many.
The French monarchy, in essence, was like a grand old ship, beautifully constructed in its time, but now sailing through increasingly rough seas, with a hull weakened by age and a cargo of outdated practices. The materials of its construction, while once strong, could no longer withstand the strain, and the labor organization of its crew was too accustomed to established routines to adapt quickly. The kingdom as a whole was experiencing the profound challenges of a system that had ceased to serve the needs of its people, a creaking edifice destined for a significant and perhaps unavoidable transformation. In the years leading up to that fateful summer of 1789, the air across France seemed to hum with a quiet restlessness, a persistent undercurrent beneath the surface of daily life. While the grand pronouncements of the monarchy continued, the careful studies of thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Denis Diderot were finding their way into more hands. Their ideas about individual rights and the sovereignty of the people slowly taking root. These were not the sort of arguments typically found in the grand halls of Versailles, but rather whispered in the smoky backrooms of Parisian cafes and printed on small, inexpensive pamphlets that circulated with surprising speed. The materials that fueled this burgeoning discontent were words and concepts, painstakingly crafted and disseminated through a network of printing presses and salon gatherings. The labor organization of this intellectual movement involved dedicated writers, printers, and readers, all engaging in the slow but steady work of shaping public thought. The challenges were significant. The authorities sought to suppress these challenging ideas through censorship, and reaching the common man with complex philosophical arguments required considerable effort and adaptation. Yet the very act of engaging with these new ways of thinking, of questioning the established order, began to awaken a sense of possibility, a belief that a different kind of society might be achievable. These circulating ideas, often expressed in the form of essays and published arguments, offered a stark contrast to the inherited privileges and duties that defined the Ancien Régime. Consider how the sheer effort involved in producing and distributing these printed materials was a testament to the growing desire for knowledge and change. Printers worked long hours, their hands stained with ink, carefully setting type and running presses to meet a demand that surprised even them. The technical processes of printing, though becoming more refined, still demanded a skilled hand and a deep understanding of the equipment, turning raw materials like paper and ink into vessels of potent ideas. The labor organization extended to the booksellers who displayed these works and the patrons who purchased them, often sharing them amongst neighbors and friends to maximize their reach. The challenges here included not only the risk of confiscation by royal censors, but also the simple fact that literacy rates, while improving, were not universal, meaning these ideas had to be explained and debated aloud, further spreading their influence through conversation. This period saw the development of what could be called an intellectual infrastructure, a network designed to bypass traditional channels of authority and communicate directly with a wider populace. Salons, often hosted by influential women, became important centers for these discussions, providing a space where men and women from different social circles could gather and engage in spirited debate. The materials used in these gatherings were not of gold or silver, but rather the carefully reasoned arguments presented, the insightful observations shared, and the challenging questions posed, all intended to illuminate the path toward reform.
The labor organization within these intellectual circles involved individuals who cultivated these spaces, acting as facilitators and connectors, ensuring that diverse perspectives were heard and considered. The challenges at these meetings were often subtle: navigating social etiquette, the risk of inadvertently offending powerful individuals, and the sheer difficulty of distilling complex thought into accessible conversation.
The sheer volume of pamphlets and treatises being produced meant that the materials of political discourse were expanding at an unprecedented rate, moving beyond the formal pronouncements of the court. These printed discussions often focused on specific grievances, such as the unfair distribution of taxes or the arbitrary power wielded by local lords. The technical processes of writing and disseminating these critiques involved a clear understanding of what would resonate with ordinary people, using language that was both persuasive and accessible. The labor organization of those who authored these texts, often operating under pseudonyms to avoid reprisal, was one of quiet dedication. Their efforts focused on crafting arguments that could withstand scrutiny and inspire action. The challenges they faced included the constant threat of discovery and the knowledge that their words could lead to imprisonment or worse. Yet the conviction in their cause often outweighed these fears. When King Louis XVI, facing a severe financial crisis, reluctantly agreed to convene the Estates General, an assembly that had not met for over 170 years, it was seen by many as a potential turning point. This gathering was intended to address the nation's dire financial straits, but the fundamental structure of the assembly itself, divided into 3 estates representing the clergy, the nobility, and the common people, held the seeds of profound conflict. The materials for this momentous occasion included the royal summons, the cahiers de doléances, or lists of grievances compiled by communities across the country, and the established rules of parliamentary procedure, which had long favored the privileged orders. The labor organization of preparing these grievances, painstakingly documenting local complaints and hopes for reform, was a massive undertaking involving countless individuals and communities, all hoping their voices would finally be heard at the highest level. The challenges were immediate and profound: how to ensure fair representation and voting, how to overcome the entrenched power of the first 2 estates, and how to translate widespread discontent into concrete political change. This summoning of the Estates General, intended to solve a financial problem, quickly became a stage for a deeper structural issue: how the nation would be represented. The voting mechanism, where each estate voted as a bloc, meant that the third estate, despite representing the vast majority of the French population, could always be outvoted by the combined strength of the clergy and nobility. The technical processes of parliamentary debate and negotiation were immediately tested, as deputies from the third estate argued for voting by head rather than by estate to ensure their numerical advantage translated into political influence. The materials that became central to this debate were not just the printed arguments, but the very concept of representation and the rights of the common people to have an equal say in their own governance. The labor organization of the deputies focused on building alliances, drafting proposals, and presenting a united front against the traditional power structures. The challenges were formidable, challenging centuries of precedent and facing the authority of the king and the privileged estates, who were resistant to any fundamental alteration of the existing order. It was in this tense atmosphere, amidst the debates over voting procedures and representation, that the Third Estate took a bold and unprecedented step. When their requests for reform were met with resistance, they declared themselves the National Assembly on June 17, 1789, asserting that they represented the true will of the French nation. This act was a significant procedural shift, a fundamental redefinition of political authority that moved power away from the traditional estates and toward a body elected by and for the people.
The materials now involved were the declarations of the National Assembly itself, public pronouncements that challenged the very legitimacy of the old system. The labor organization shifted to the systematic work of this new assembly, its deputies tasked with drafting a constitution and enacting reforms that would reshape France from the ground up. The challenges they faced were immense, including the king's reaction, the potential for unrest from those who still supported the monarchy, and the need to establish new governmental labor organizations from scratch.
Following the declaration of the National Assembly, a wave of popular unrest began to swell, particularly in Paris. The king's dismissal of a popular minister, Jacques Necker, and the visible presence of royal troops around the city created a palpable sense of unease, leading many Parisians to fear a crackdown on the nascent revolutionary movement. The materials for self-defense, desperately needed by the agitated crowds, became the immediate focus, driving them to seek out weapons and gunpowder. The technical processes involved in organizing large groups of people, coordinating their movements, and arming them with a mixture of military weapons and improvised tools required a rapid, albeit chaotic, form of popular mobilization. The labor organization was entirely spontaneous, driven by shared anxieties and a powerful collective will to resist perceived oppression. The challenges were the lack of centralized command and the inherent danger in an armed populace confronting established authority. This popular energy, fueled by a deep-seated distrust of royal power and a desire for tangible symbols of change, culminated in the events of July 14, 1789. The storming of the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison in Paris, became the defining moment of this initial uprising. The crowds, seeking arms and gunpowder, converged on the fortress, where they engaged in a fierce confrontation with the garrison. The materials used by the attackers included muskets seized from the Invalides earlier that day, along with pikes, axes, and other makeshift weapons. The technical processes involved in breaching the thick stone walls and overcoming the defenders were brutal and arduous, relying on sheer numbers and determined effort. The labor organization was again decentralized and driven by immediate necessity, with different groups taking on specific roles in the assault. The challenges were the formidable defenses of the Bastille and the risk of heavy casualties, yet the symbolic importance of striking a blow against royal authority propelled the attackers forward. In the wake of the Bastille's fall, a wave of unrest spread throughout the French countryside, a phenomenon historians would later call the Great Fear. Peasants, emboldened by the events in Paris and worried about aristocratic plots to suppress the revolution, began to attack manors, burn feudal records, and assert their freedom from ancient obligations. The materials of this rural upheaval included torches used to set fires, scythes and pitchforks employed as weapons, and the destruction of paper documents that symbolized centuries of servitude. The labor organization here was an eruption of collective action, driven by generations of hardship and a sudden, potent sense of opportunity to break free from oppressive systems. The challenges for these rural communities were the threat of reprisal from local nobles and the lack of any formal structure to guide their actions, leading to a period of widespread yet localized revolt. The National Assembly, now consolidating its authority and seeking to provide a legal framework for the new order, turned its attention to codifying the principles that would guide the reformed nation. This led to the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a foundational document that proclaimed universal rights and liberties. The technical processes of legislative drafting, involving meticulous debate, amendment, and voting, were central to this work, aiming to translate abstract ideals into concrete legal principles. The materials were the Enlightenment philosophies of liberty, equality, and fraternity,
meticulously woven into articles that defined citizenship and governmental responsibility. The labor organization of the deputies was focused on establishing new legal and administrative structures, systematically dismantling the old feudal system and creating a unified nation. The challenges included the inherent difficulty of achieving consensus on such profound changes and overcoming the lingering resistance from those who benefited from the previous regime. The abolition of feudal privileges, a direct consequence of the Assembly's work and the pressure from the rural revolts, represented a sweeping procedural change that eradicated centuries of ingrained social and economic hierarchy. This decree, enacted on the night of August 4, 1789, effectively ended the tithes owed to the church and the manorial dues owed to nobles, fundamentally altering the structure of French society. The materials that were rendered obsolete were the legal contracts and customary obligations that had bound peasants to their lords for generations. The labor organization involved in enforcing these changes required clear communication and administrative action across the country, ensuring that these new legal principles were understood and applied. The challenges included the resistance of some nobles to relinquish their hereditary rights and the complex task of reorganizing land ownership and taxation. This rapid dismantling of the old order demonstrated a willingness to undertake radical reforms, even when the full consequences were not yet clear. While the National Assembly worked to build a new France, King Louis XVI found himself in an increasingly precarious position, his authority eroded and his every move scrutinized. His attempted flight from France in June 1791 with his family was a desperate gamble to escape the revolutionary capital and rally support from foreign powers. The technical processes involved in this escape were elaborate, relying on disguised carriages, altered travel plans, and pre-arranged rendezvous with loyalists. The materials were the royal treasury, providing funds for the journey, and a network of communications, some of which failed to reach their intended recipients. The labor organization was a small clandestine operation, involving a handful of trusted individuals who aided the royal family's movement. The challenges were immense. The king's recognizable appearance, the effectiveness of the revolutionary postal service in intercepting correspondence, and the sheer difficulty of traversing a country increasingly mobilized by revolutionary sentiment. The eventual capture of the royal family at Varennes, a small town not far from the border, had profound and immediate repercussions for the course of the revolution. It shattered any remaining illusions about the king's commitment to the new constitutional monarchy and fueled widespread anger and distrust. This event irrevocably damaged Louis XVI's credibility, convincing many that he was an untrustworthy figure actively working against the interests of the French people. The materials that now defined the perception of the monarchy were the images of the king being escorted back to Paris under guard, a stark contrast to the regal processions of the past. The labor organization of the revolutionaries shifted towards a more unified stance against the monarchy, with calls for a republic growing louder and more insistent. The challenges were now centered on how to govern without a king whose loyalty was so demonstrably absent, and how to deal with the inevitable political fallout from this failed escape. As the revolution entered its more radical phase, the threat of foreign intervention intensified, with European monarchies increasingly concerned about the spread of revolutionary ideas. France, feeling besieged, declared war on Austria in April 1792, a conflict that would soon engulf much of Europe and profoundly shape the internal politics of the revolution. The technical processes of raising and organizing armies on a massive scale, training citizen soldiers, and equipping them for sustained warfare became paramount. The materials for this national defense included vast quantities of arms, ammunition, and supplies, requiring a considerable logistical effort to procure and distribute. The labor organization involved the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of men, transforming ordinary citizens into soldiers and creating vast logistical networks to support them. The challenges were the inexperience of these new troops, the difficulty in supplying such large forces, and the constant pressure of fighting against seasoned professional armies. The external pressures of war, coupled with growing internal divisions, led to the formal abolition of the monarchy and the declaration of the First French Republic in September 1792. This dramatic shift in governance marked a decisive break from centuries of monarchical rule and ushered in a new era of political experimentation. The technical processes of establishing a republican government, including the election of a national convention and the drafting of a new constitution, were complex and fraught with political struggle. The materials of this new republic were the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, now enshrined in a new political structure, and the fervent patriotism of a nation defending itself against foreign powers. The labor organization was directed towards consolidating Republican authority, prosecuting the war effort, and debating the future of the nation. The challenges included managing political factions, maintaining public order, and facing the existential threat posed by the invading armies. The declaration of the Republic was quickly followed by the trial and execution of King Louis XVI in January 1793, a momentous event that symbolized the final severance from the past and sent shockwaves across Europe. This act was the culmination of intense political debate within the National Convention, with factions such as the Jacobins advocating for the king's death as a necessary step to secure the Republic. The technical processes of a national trial, involving prosecution, defense, and voting on the verdict and sentence, were meticulously carried out, though the proceedings were heavily influenced by the prevailing political climate. The materials of the trial included evidence presented against the king, the arguments made by the prosecution and defense, and the ballots cast by the deputies. The labor organization of the convention was focused on the momentous task of judging a former head of state and determining the fate of the monarchy. The challenges were the immense historical weight of the decision and the potential for further internal division and external condemnation. In response to the ongoing war, internal revolts, and a perceived threat from counter-revolutionary elements, the National Convention established the Committee of Public Safety in April 1793. This powerful body gradually assumed de facto executive authority, tasked with defending the Republic against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. The technical processes of governance under the committee involved coordinating national defense, implementing economic controls, and overseeing the judicial system to suppress dissent. The materials at its disposal included decrees, intelligence reports, and the instruments of law enforcement and judicial action. The labor organization was highly centralized and efficient, with committee members directing various subcommittees and representatives responsible for enforcing policies across the country. The challenges were the overwhelming demands of total war and the constant need to quell internal opposition, leading to increasingly stringent measures. This period, often referred to as the Reign of Terror, saw the Committee of Public Safety implement a systematic policy of repression aimed at eliminating perceived enemies of the revolution. The revolutionary tribunals, established to swiftly judge suspects, became central to this apparatus of control. The technical processes of these tribunals involved rapid accusations, limited defense opportunities, and swift sentencing, often leading to execution by guillotine. The materials used were lists of suspected individuals, denunciations from citizens, and the legal frameworks, however distorted, that underpinned these proceedings. The labor organization included judges, prosecutors, jurors, and executioners, all operating under the directives of the committee, creating a highly organized, albeit terrifying, judicial system. The challenges were the perversion of justice, the climate of widespread fear, and the immense human toll of this systematic repression. The economic policies implemented during the Revolution, particularly the law of the maximum, which fixed prices for essential goods, and the management of the assignat, a form of paper currency backed by the value of confiscated church lands, were attempts to stabilize a turbulent economy. These measures aimed to control inflation, prevent hoarding, and ensure the supply of necessities for the war effort and the population. The technical processes involved setting price ceilings, requisitioning agricultural produce and manufactured goods, and attempting to manage the circulation of the assignat. The materials were the goods themselves, grain, cloth, tools, and the assignat notes, which began to lose value rapidly due to overprinting and a lack of confidence. The labor organization of farmers, merchants, and ordinary citizens was heavily impacted, as they struggled to comply with or circumvent these regulations, leading to shortages, black markets, and widespread resentment. The challenges were the inherent difficulty of controlling a complex economy during a period of such radical upheaval and the unintended consequences of these interventions.
The revolutionary government's need to field massive armies led to the implementation of the levée en masse, or mass conscription, a revolutionary concept that transformed the nature of warfare. This policy mobilized vast numbers of citizens, creating a citizen army unlike anything seen before in European history. The labor organization of the army was a complex undertaking, requiring the recruitment, training, equipping, and supply of hundreds of thousands of men, drawn from all walks of life. The materials were standardized muskets, uniforms, artillery pieces, and the vast logistical networks needed to move and sustain these forces across vast distances. The technical processes involved developing new methods of military organization, command structures, and battlefield tactics suitable for large citizen formations. The challenges were immense, training raw recruits, ensuring adequate supply lines, and maintaining morale in the face of constant combat. Yet, the effectiveness of these citizen armies in defending the Republic against the coalitions of European monarchies demonstrated the power of this transformed labor organization. The excesses of the Reign of Terror eventually led to a backlash within the National Convention, culminating in the Thermidorian Reaction in July 1794, which saw the downfall and execution of Maximilien Robespierre, the dominant figure of the Committee of Public Safety. This marked a significant shift in the revolution's direction, moving away from the radicalism of the Terror towards a more conservative phase. The technical processes of Robespierre's arrest and execution were swift and decisive, executed by those within the convention who feared becoming the next targets of the Terror. The materials that facilitated this change were the shifting political alliances within the convention and the popular weariness with the relentless violence. The labor organization of the government saw a return to more conventional political structures, though factionalism remained a persistent challenge. The challenges included managing the lingering effects of the Terror, continuing the wars, and establishing a stable new government, leading to the establishment of the Directory. The Directory, the five-man executive body that governed France after the Thermidorian Reaction, proved to be an unstable and often ineffective regime, plagued by corruption, political infighting, and continued military challenges. It was during this period of uncertainty that a rising military star, Napoleon Bonaparte, gained prominence through his successful campaigns in Italy and Egypt.
Napoleon's victories, combined with his charismatic leadership and astute political maneuvering, made him a popular figure, capable of projecting an image of strength and stability that the Directory desperately lacked. The materials that fueled his ascent were the loyal armies he commanded and the public's growing weariness with the Directory's perceived incompetence and instability. The labor organization under Napoleon began to show a distinct military discipline and a clear hierarchy of command. The challenges he faced included navigating the complex political landscape and capitalizing on the opportunities presented by the Directory's weakness. In November 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup d'état, overthrowing the Directory and establishing the consulate, with himself as first consul. This marked a significant turning point in the revolution, as power became increasingly centralized in the hands of a single strong leader. The technical processes of this coup involved the skillful coordination of military and political support, effectively sidelining the existing government. The materials that enabled this takeover were the unwavering loyalty of his troops and the widespread public desire for order and strong leadership after years of upheaval. The labor organization shifted dramatically, with Napoleon at the apex directing administrative reforms, financial stabilization, and the codification of laws with unprecedented efficiency. The challenges he faced were to consolidate his authority, restore order to France, and navigate the complex web of European power politics, laying the groundwork for his eventual empire. The consulate period saw Napoleon implement a series of far-reaching reforms that reshaped France and had a lasting impact on the continent. Among these was the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive and unified system of laws that replaced the patchwork of existing legal traditions. The technical processes involved in drafting this code required the systematic review and revision of centuries of legal precedents, transforming them into a coherent and accessible legal framework. The materials were the existing French laws, Roman law influences, and Enlightenment legal philosophies, all synthesized into a single authoritative document. The labor organization was directed by Napoleon, with legal scholars and administrators working diligently to codify these new principles, emphasizing clarity, uniformity, and equality before the law. The challenges included reconciling disparate legal traditions and ensuring the code's practical application across the nation. Such systematic legal reforms reveal the complexity of historical change.
The air in Versailles carried the faint scent of beeswax polish and the distant murmur of courtly life, a stark contrast to the simmering discontent growing beyond the palace gates. For generations, the fabric of French society had been woven with threads of privilege for the few and obligation for the many, a system known as the Ancien Régime, or Old Regime. This structure divided the population into three orders, or estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the vast majority, the third estate, which encompassed everyone from wealthy merchants to the humblest peasant farmers. Most of the tax burden, levied to fund lavish courts and costly wars, rested squarely upon the shoulders of the third estate, while the first two estates, enjoying extensive exemptions, contributed little. The materials available to the monarchy for effective governance were essentially worn-out traditions and entrenched privileges, ill-suited to the increasing financial strain and the changing economic realities of the nation. This imbalance created a deeply inequitable system of labor organization, where feudal dues and obligations still bound many peasants to the land and their lords, hindering efficient agricultural practices and perpetuating widespread hardship. The inherent challenges in maintaining such a system were becoming increasingly apparent as the treasury dwindled and the needs of the populace went unmet. The monarchy, embodied by King Louis XVI, found itself presiding over a realm burdened by debt,
a consequence of numerous expensive ventures, including support for the American Revolution and the extravagant upkeep of the royal court. The accumulated weight of these financial and social pressures was becoming unsustainable. The intellectual currents of the era began to challenge the very foundations of this rigid order. Thinkers of the Enlightenment, such as Voltaire and Rousseau, championed ideas of reason, individual rights, and the concept of popular sovereignty, where the ultimate authority rested with the people, not a divinely appointed monarch. The technical processes of disseminating these revolutionary ideas relied heavily on the printing press, allowing for the wide circulation of pamphlets, books, and philosophical essays that questioned established authority and advocated for reform. These materials of intellectual discourse, the carefully crafted arguments and persuasive rhetoric, proved to be far more potent in igniting change than any physical force at this nascent stage. The labor organization of this intellectual movement involved a network of thinkers, writers, and engaged readers who debated these new concepts in salons and coffee houses across France. The challenges inherent in spreading such ideas included not only the risk of censorship by an authoritarian regime, but also the sheer difficulty of communicating complex philosophical arguments to a broad audience. Nevertheless, the power of these new ideologies to sway public opinion and inspire a desire for fundamental societal change was undeniable, a potent reminder of how ideas can serve as a powerful catalyst for transformation. In response to the dire financial crisis, King Louis XVI made a fateful decision in 1789 to convene the Estates General. This ancient assembly, dormant for over 170 years, was meant to represent all three estates and advise the monarch, particularly on matters of taxation and reform. The materials for this gathering included the royal summons, the cahier de doléances, lists of grievances compiled by each estate, and the established yet contentious parliamentary rules governing their deliberations. The king's ministers hoped this assembly would offer solutions to the kingdom's fiscal woes. The labor organization of the deputies, arriving from different corners of France and representing a wide spectrum of interests, was inherently complex, requiring them to forge consensus and articulate the collective demands of their respective estates. The challenges they faced were immense. They had to overcome centuries of entrenched tradition, navigate the king's royal authority, and, most critically, unite a disparate third estate that felt perpetually marginalized. This gathering, intended to stabilize the kingdom, instead became the crucible where the old order would finally fracture. A significant point of contention arose immediately regarding the voting procedures. Traditionally, each estate voted as a single block, meaning the first and second estates, with their combined interests, could easily outvote the third estate, even though the third estate represented the overwhelming majority of the French population. The third estate deputies, recognizing this systemic disadvantage, demanded that voting be conducted by head rather than by estate, a move that would give their greater numbers real power. This procedural deadlock became the central focus of their efforts, representing a critical procedural battle. When the king and his advisors refused to concede to the demand for voting by head, the deputies of the Third Estate, joined by some sympathetic members of the clergy and nobility, made a bold and unprecedented declaration. On June 17, 1789, they proclaimed themselves the National Assembly, asserting that they alone represented the true will of the French nation and possessed the authority to draft a new constitution. This declaration was a direct challenge to royal authority, a procedural maneuver that fundamentally altered the balance of power. They were quite literally taking the reins of governance into their own hands. Following this audacious act, the deputies, finding their usual meeting hall locked and guarded, a move they interpreted as an attempt by the king to dissolve them, gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court. There, on June 20, 1789, they took a solemn oath known as the Tennis Court Oath, vowing not to disband until they had drafted and established a constitution for France. This oath, a powerful display of their unity and resolve, demonstrated the increasing effectiveness of their collective action. Sources from the time describe the deputies, many of whom were lawyers and men of letters, binding themselves with a shared purpose, their voices resonating with a new conviction. This deliberate labor organization, the painstaking process of debate, drafting, and voting on articles of a new constitution, marked a significant shift in how the nation's materials, its laws, its governance, and its future were to be managed. The challenges were not merely theoretical. They involved transforming abstract principles of liberty and equality into tangible legal frameworks, a process that required immense patience and political skill. This period underscored the power of systematic legislative action as a means of societal restructuring, a far cry from the spontaneous outbursts that would soon erupt. One could almost hear the scratching of quills on parchment, a sound that would soon echo across the land.
The Assembly continued its work, and on August 4, 1789, in a dramatic night session, many nobles and clergy, perhaps sensing the unstoppable momentum of change or fearing for their own safety, renounced their traditional privileges. This included the abolition of feudal dues and the end of special tax exemptions for the clergy and nobility. The materials that were shed were centuries of inherited rights and exemptions, replaced by the principle of legal equality for all citizens. This wholesale dismantling of the Ancien Régime structures, though met with resistance from some, was a remarkably swift and systematic legislative victory, fundamentally altering the social and legal landscape of France. The process was intricate, involving the formal renunciation of ancient rights, each one a formal step away from the old order. This investigation illuminates broader forces that shape societies. The air in Paris in the summer of 1789 carried the restless murmur of a city on the edge. For weeks, reports had filtered in from the countryside, tales of unease and outright revolt spreading like wildfire. This wave of unrest, known as the Great Fear, had roots deeper than mere hunger. It was a visceral reaction to centuries of ingrained obligations and the growing awareness that the old order was cracking. Across countless villages, peasants armed with scythes, pitchforks, and whatever blunt instruments they could find moved with a common purpose, targeting the manor houses of local lords. The primary materials of their grievances were not just empty granaries, but the very parchments that detailed feudal dues and hereditary services, the paper records that bound them to generations of servitude. These documents were systematically sought out, dragged into communal squares, and consumed by flames, the crackling of burning parchment a new sound in the rural quiet. This widespread destruction of records represented a profound rejection of the established labor organization. Generations had toiled under arrangements that benefited the nobility and clergy disproportionately, with commoners often owing a portion of their harvest, specific days of work, or fees for using the lord's mill or oven. The intellectual challenge of disentangling these complex obligations was immense, but for the people of the fields, the answer became simple. The records themselves were the problem, and their eradication was the solution. The challenges were not just the physical effort of finding and destroying these documents, but also overcoming the ingrained fear of reprisal from those who held power, a fear that had kept them subservient for so long. Yet the momentum of collective action, fueled by shared hardship and whispers of change, seemed to override this caution in many places. Meanwhile, in the capital, the burgeoning National Assembly grappled with the escalating popular sentiment.
The symbolic heart of royal authority, the Bastille prison, stood as a stark reminder of the king's power to arbitrarily imprison his subjects. On July 14th, driven by rumors of royal troops amassing and a desperate need for gunpowder to defend themselves, the citizens of Paris took a decisive step. The technical processes of a popular uprising began to unfold with a desperate urgency. Crowds converged on the Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital, seizing thousands of muskets, cannons, and bayonets. This collection of weaponry, readily available and desperately needed, became the immediate material for the assault on the Bastille itself, a fortress perceived as a symbol of oppression, though it held few prisoners at the time. The storming of the Bastille was not a planned military operation, but a spontaneous eruption, a culmination of days of unrest and a deep-seated distrust of the monarchy. The crowds, a mix of artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers, converged on the fortress, demanding its surrender. Accounts from those present describe the deafening roar of thousands of voices, the clang of metal as makeshift weapons were readied, and the sharp crackle of musket fire as the defenders resisted. The labor organization involved was one of sheer collective will. Individuals pushed forward, forming human chains to pass ammunition and surge towards the gates. The challenges were immense, facing trained soldiers and fortified walls with often insufficient arms and little organized command. Yet their determination proved overwhelming. Once inside, the jubilant crowd released the handful of prisoners and, crucially, seized the gunpowder stored within the fortress. This acquisition was vital, providing the material needed to arm the growing number of citizens who were ready to defend their city. The successful capture of the Bastille and the gruesome aftermath for its governor symbolized a decisive break from the past. It demonstrated a powerful, if unrefined, capacity for collective action when ordinary people felt their grievances could no longer be ignored. And it sent a clear message to the king and the remaining vestiges of the old nobility about the force of popular will. The sheer human will, the readiness to risk life and limb, was the most potent force on display that day. The reverberations of the Bastille's fall spread rapidly, not just through Paris, but throughout the nation. The peasant uprisings, already underway in the countryside, gained renewed vigor. The destruction of feudal records, the burning of manor houses, and instances of threatening or attacking local aristocrats became more widespread. This rural component of the revolution, often referred to as the Great Fear, was characterized by a widespread panic and an almost instinctive dismantling of the symbols of manorial authority. The materials involved here were not just the documents, but also the physical structures of aristocratic power, the manor houses themselves, and the tools of their oppression, such as the justice stones or guild halls that dictated local economic life. The labor organization in these rural areas was fundamentally about reclaiming autonomy. Peasants, often isolated in their struggles, found a shared purpose in confronting their local overlords. This movement was largely decentralized, driven by immediate grievances rather than a unified strategy, yet its impact was profound. The challenges for the rural populace were to overcome their traditional deference to authority and to coordinate action, often with limited communication between villages. The sounds that punctuated these events were not the organized drills of soldiers, but the shouts of angry crowds, the splintering of wood as doors were forced open, and the cries of those who found themselves on the wrong side of the people's fury. This period, marked by both the urban assault on the Bastille and the rural revolts, highlights a critical aspect of revolutionary change: the translation of deeply held grievances into physical action. The sheer weight of accumulated injustices, the daily grind of unequal burdens, found an outlet in these widespread acts of defiance. The technical processes at play were rudimentary but effective. Gathering in numbers, identifying targets of resentment, and applying physical force to dismantle symbols of power. The materials were the common implements of agriculture and daily life, transformed into instruments of protest, a testament to the ingenuity born of desperation.
The widespread nature of these uprisings, the simultaneous eruption of discontent across different regions and social strata, presented a unique challenge to the established order. It was no longer a matter of quelling isolated pockets of unrest, but of responding to a nationwide convulsion. The king, receiving news of these events, faced a stark reality. His authority was being actively undermined, not just by the decrees of the National Assembly, but by the direct actions of his own people. The very materials of governance, loyalty, obedience, respect for law, were actively being rejected by large segments of the populace, particularly those who had borne the heaviest burdens of the Ancien Régime. The immediate aftermath of these events saw a rush by many nobles to flee the country, a phenomenon known as emigration. This further weakened the existing power structures and, paradoxically, often fueled further suspicion and radicalization among those who remained. The labor organization that continued within the revolutionary government now had to contend with both the demands of the populace and the absence of many who had previously held positions of authority. The challenges for the National Assembly were to channel this raw energy into constructive reform while also ensuring a degree of order and stability. The sheer momentum of events had outpaced reasoned debate, forcing rapid adaptation. This era undeniably demonstrated the potent force of collective popular will when unleashed. The systematic dismantling of feudal symbols, whether in Parisian streets or rural fields, represented a visceral and immediate renegotiation of societal contracts. The sheer scale of these actions, driven by a shared sense of grievance and a newfound belief in their collective power, fundamentally altered the landscape of French society. The common people, through their actions, asserted a new kind of agency, one that would continue to shape the trajectory of the revolution. The tools of protest, from muskets to burning parchments, exemplified how ordinary individuals, when united by a common cause, could challenge and begin to dismantle entrenched systems of power. The question lingers. As these events unfolded, how does a populace, long conditioned by deference and the weight of tradition, find the collective courage to rise and reshape its own destiny? It seems the cumulative burden of hardship, when coupled with the compelling articulation of new possibilities, can indeed forge a will to action that transcends generations of quiet endurance. The physical destruction of the old order's records and symbols was a profound statement, the burning of those parchments a symbolic cleansing that allowed for the potential of new beginnings. The courage of the Parisians at the Bastille and the widespread revolts that followed illustrated how a populace can respond to fundamental challenges through determined, unified action. The careful steps taken to establish the National Assembly, a body representing the united Third Estate, meant that France now possessed a recognized legislative voice, distinct from the monarchy's accustomed authority. This assertion of collective will was not a mere declaration, it was the systematic application of a new understanding of sovereignty, where legitimacy stemmed from the people, not divine right. The deputies, having declared themselves the primary lawmaking body, immediately turned their attention to dismantling the aged structures that had burdened the nation for centuries. Their initial work involved not just pronouncements, but the practical process of legislating change, laying out a new framework for how society would function. This constructive phase began with the creation of foundational documents that sought to encapsulate the ideals driving the revolution:
most notably the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The materials for this pivotal document were the philosophical treatises of the Enlightenment and the collective grievances articulated in the Cahiers de doléances, the lists of complaints prepared for the Estates General. The technical processes of drafting involved intense debate, revision, and eventual consensus building among the deputies, transforming abstract concepts of liberty and equality into codified principles. The labor organization of the Assembly shifted to that of a deliberative body, meticulously crafting laws and organizing the administration of a reformed state. One of the most immediate and impactful reforms was the abolition of feudal privileges, a decision enacted with considerable procedural efficiency. For generations, the lives of ordinary people had been governed by a complex web of obligations tied to land ownership and social standing, remnants of a feudal system that the Ancien Régime had preserved. The National Assembly, through a series of decrees, systematically erased these ancient rights and duties, effectively severing the legal and economic ties that bound peasants to lords and the church. This process involved identifying and nullifying countless historical contracts and customary laws, a massive undertaking that required careful legal drafting. The materials consumed in this legislative process were not physical goods, but legal statutes and historical records, all meticulously reviewed to identify and remove vestiges of inequality. The labor organization extended beyond the debating floor. Committees were formed to research and draft legislation, ensuring that the abolition of privileges was comprehensive and legally sound. The challenges lay in the sheer volume of entrenched practices and the need to create a new system of property rights and taxation that was equitable. This was not merely symbolic, it fundamentally altered the distribution of wealth and opportunity across France, a significant restructuring of societal resources. Beyond dismantling old privileges, the Assembly also embarked on the systematic reorganization of France's administrative and judicial structures. This involved creating new departments, standardizing weights and measures, and reforming the legal system. The technical processes here were akin to rebuilding a vast engine, replacing old, worn parts with new ones designed for efficiency and fairness. The materials were the decrees themselves, the maps redrawn for new administrative districts, and the new legal codes being drafted. The labor organization within the Assembly and its appointed committees was dedicated to this vast project of state reconstruction, a monumental task requiring sustained effort. This period also saw the burgeoning of new cultural practices reflecting the revolutionary ideals. For instance, the traditional calendar, deeply tied to religious observances, was gradually supplemented by a new republican calendar, intended to secularize time and emphasize reason and natural cycles. The materials for this change were the almanacs, the astronomical charts, and the linguistic innovations required to rename months and days. The labor organization involved scholars and artists in creating this new temporal framework, an endeavor to reshape not just governance, but the very rhythm of daily life. It is worth noting that the original naming conventions for the months, such as Brumaire or Floréal, aimed to connect citizens with the agricultural seasons and the natural world, a fascinating attempt at a radical reorientation of public consciousness. However, such profound societal change was not without its inherent challenges. While the Assembly worked to create a unified nation, the specter of popular discontent and the potential for uncontrolled uprisings remained a constant concern, a point of reflection for any group attempting such sweeping reforms. The sheer speed at which traditional structures were being dismantled meant that new systems had to be implemented quickly, often before their long-term consequences could be fully assessed. This created a fertile ground for both enthusiastic adoption and lingering skepticism, as people adjusted to a vastly altered reality. The process of national reconstruction also necessitated the creation of new symbols and rituals to foster a sense of shared identity and purpose. The Fête de la Fédération, held on the first anniversary of the Bastille's fall, exemplified this effort, bringing together citizens from across France in a grand display of national unity. The materials for such events included banners, civic oaths, and the meticulously planned choreography of processions and ceremonies. The labor organization involved local committees and national organizers working in concert to ensure these demonstrations of unity were impactful and widely participated in. This served as a crucial reminder of how shared experiences and public spectacles can solidify collective identity during times of intense change.
Indeed, this phase of legislative reform and national restructuring was characterized by a systematic, albeit sometimes hurried, attempt to engineer a more rational and equitable society. The technical processes of lawmaking, administration, and symbol creation were all employed with the aim of solidifying the revolution's gains and building a foundation for a new France. The labor organization shifted from the spontaneous energy of the streets to the structured efforts of committees, deputies, and administrators, all working to translate revolutionary ideals into tangible reality. A curious detail from this period involves the adoption of new forms of address. Citizens began to replace titles like Monsieur and Madame with the more egalitarian citoyen and citoyenne, meaning citizen. This linguistic shift, seemingly minor, was a deliberate technical process to underscore the revolution's emphasis on equality and shared citizenship, a way to visually and vocally erase the old distinctions of rank. The materials here were simply words, but their widespread adoption reflected a deep-seated desire for social transformation that permeated all levels of life. This constructive period also laid bare an ongoing scholarly debate. To what extent were the reforms driven by abstract philosophical ideals versus pragmatic responses to immediate crises? While the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen clearly articulated universal principles, the practicalities of governance and the need to address widespread economic hardship undoubtedly shaped the specific legislative outcomes. Historians continue to weigh the influence of pure ideology against the pressures of circumstance in understanding the precise motivations behind these early revolutionary acts. As the National Assembly continued its work, the nation was grappling with the consequences of these sweeping changes, and the foundational principles established were soon to be tested by external forces and internal divisions. The systematic dismantling of the old order, while achieving its immediate goals, also created new vulnerabilities that would require further and often more challenging adaptation. The carefully crafted legal frameworks were yet to be fully implemented and accepted across a populace still adjusting to a profoundly altered political and social landscape. These legislative and symbolic achievements, while significant, marked only the beginning of a tumultuous journey, setting the stage for the complex interplay of reform and radicalization that would define the revolution's subsequent phases. The framework for a new France had been declared, but its enduring stability remained an open question.
King Louis XVI, a man accustomed to the gilded confines of Versailles, found himself facing a most peculiar predicament. For years, advisors had spoken of unrest, of the grumbling discontent among the Third Estate, yet the sheer magnitude of the king's own planned departure from Paris was an undertaking of a far more personal and perilous nature. His ministers had meticulously charted the intended journey, a discreet exodus aiming for the perceived safety of loyalist strongholds near the Austrian border, a region where his wife, Marie Antoinette, still held considerable familial influence. The materials for this endeavor were not armies or pronouncements, but rather carefully chosen coaches, disguised identities, and a network of sympathetic couriers tasked with relaying coded messages. This clandestine operation required a precise labor organization, relying on a small cadre of trusted individuals whose loyalty was paramount. The challenges were immense, stemming from the very secrecy of the plan. Any misstep, any whisper of discovery could unravel the entire scheme and plunge the kingdom into even deeper turmoil. The king's decision to flee stemmed from a growing despair over his dwindling authority and a deep-seated fear for his family's safety, a sentiment understandable for any father, though its political ramifications were profound. Accounts from the time describe the king's growing agitation, his nights disturbed by the clamor of the Parisian streets and the increasingly assertive demands of the newly formed National Assembly. He believed, perhaps naively, that by removing himself from the immediate pressures of the capital, he could rally support and eventually negotiate from a position of strength, a strategy that ignored the burgeoning force of public opinion. The technical processes involved in orchestrating such a departure were intricate, from securing reliable transport to ensuring the necessary funds were amassed without attracting undue attention. The labor organization was therefore highly specialized, involving individuals skilled in deception and quiet logistics, a far cry from the public ceremonies of the royal court. This planned escape, however, was fraught with inherent challenges, most notably the constant threat of recognition. The king, accustomed to being identified by his regal bearing and the opulent displays of his court, would now have to blend into a world of commoners, a task for which he was ill prepared. Historical records indicate that the royal family's attempt to travel incognito involved a rather large and conspicuous retinue of carriages, hardly the image of discreet flight. The materials of their disguise included expensive clothing that, while perhaps intended to appear fashionable for travelers, still stood out against the simpler attire of ordinary citizens, betraying their true status. The very wealth they possessed, the materials they carried for comfort and as emergency funds, became a potential beacon for suspicion. Furthermore, the labor organization of the escape relied on a delicate web of communication and cooperation between different parties. Couriers were dispatched ahead to prepare fresh horses and accommodations, while loyalists in various towns were expected to provide discreet assistance. This required not only precise timing, but also a deep understanding of the loyalties within different regions of France. The challenges here were manifold. News traveled slowly, and a single miscommunication could lead to the entire plan falling apart. The very distances involved, coupled with the need for absolute secrecy, made the coordination of such an operation incredibly complex, testing the limits of loyalty and efficiency. Meanwhile, across the vastness of France, the seeds of suspicion sown by the king's perceived evasion began to sprout into widespread distrust. The technical processes of information dissemination were rapidly evolving. Word of the royal family's departure and their subsequent apprehension spread like wildfire through pamphlets and word-of-mouth accounts. This rapid diffusion of news meant that the king's failed attempt was not a localized incident, but a national event that further eroded any remaining faith in his leadership. The materials used to spread this news were simple, printed sheets of paper, public criers, yet their impact was profound, shaping the collective understanding of the monarch's actions. The failure to escape was not a singular event, but a culmination of several procedural missteps and a failure to fully grasp the pervasive surveillance networks that had begun to emerge. The king's own indecisiveness during the journey and the eventual recognition by a former postal worker who knew him from his royal appearances proved to be the decisive factors. This recognition, a simple human interaction based on visual memory, became a critical piece of material evidence against him. The labor organization of the revolutionary authorities, particularly the National Guard, proved more effective in this instance, demonstrating a swift and organized response to intercept the fleeing monarchs. The ramifications of this failed escape were immediate and far-reaching. It irrevocably damaged King Louis XVI's credibility, transforming him from a sovereign struggling with his parliament to a captive of his own people, a prisoner in his palace. The challenges that now faced the monarchy were no longer about negotiation, but about survival. The very notion of a constitutional monarchy began to falter, as the king's actions were widely interpreted as a betrayal of the nation and its burgeoning ideals. The materials of statecraft, once wielded with the pretense of royal authority, now seemed hollow in the face of such a profound loss of public trust. This incident served as a stark illustration of how even well-intentioned efforts, if poorly executed and lacking widespread support, can backfire dramatically. The king's belief that he could simply withdraw and regroup was a fundamental miscalculation of the revolutionary momentum that had already taken hold. The labor organization of the revolutionaries, particularly their ability to mobilize citizens and establish effective communication networks, demonstrated a growing capacity for collective action that the monarchy had underestimated. The challenges of governing a nation in such a state of flux required a far greater understanding of public sentiment than the king or his advisors had demonstrated.
The king's flight and its failure were not merely a personal setback, but a pivotal turning point in the revolution, accelerating the movement towards a republic and intensifying the distrust between the crown and the populace. It offered a clear and undeniable instance where the king had actively sought to circumvent the will of the people and escape the responsibilities he had sworn to uphold. The materials of this political crisis were not physical objects, but the very principles of governance and the perceived legitimacy of the ruling power, which had been severely undermined. This event underscored how deeply intertwined the personal actions of a leader are with the stability of the state. Modern research continues to uncover new dimensions of these fateful decisions, revealing the intricate interplay of personal choices and the seismic shifts in national sentiment. As the winds of change gusted through France, the established order found itself increasingly strained, its foundations weakened by years of fiscal mismanagement and social stratification. The very air seemed to hum with a new energy, a palpable sense of anticipation that had been building for decades. This burgeoning sentiment was not born of a single event, but rather a confluence of intellectual awakening and mounting economic distress, a perfect storm that threatened to wash away the ancient foundations of the kingdom. The seeds of discontent, sown in fertile ground of public grievance, were now beginning to sprout, promising a harvest of unprecedented transformation. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, advocating for reason, individual rights, and the sovereignty of the people, had found a potent medium for dissemination. Consider the technical processes of communication then available. The printing press, though not entirely new, was used with a fervor and ingenuity that spread ideas with remarkable speed. Pamphlets, often inexpensive and readily available, carried the arguments of philosophers like Rousseau and Voltaire directly into the hands of those who might have previously been excluded from such discourse. Salons and coffee houses, places where thinkers and educated citizens gathered, became vibrant centers for debate, allowing these radical notions to be discussed, dissected, and absorbed. The materials of this intellectual revolution were, in essence, words and concepts, which proved far more powerful in shaping minds than any decree issued from Versailles. The labor organization involved not just the philosophers themselves, but the printers, the distributors, and the engaged citizens who formed these intellectual communities. The primary challenges lay in overcoming censorship, which was a constant threat, and in bridging the gap between abstract philosophical arguments and the lived realities of the common populace.
This intellectual groundwork, however, proved foundational to all that followed. This era of burgeoning ideas brought forth a pivotal moment when King Louis XVI, facing an intractable financial crisis, made the fateful decision to convene the Estates General. This ancient assembly, representing the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, had not met for over 170 years. The materials for this gathering were the formal summons, the lists of grievances known as cahiers de doléances, which poured in from across the nation, and the long-standing, yet increasingly contentious, rules governing parliamentary procedure. The labor organization of the deputies themselves was a complex undertaking, representing a vast spectrum of interests within the Third Estate, from wealthy merchants to impoverished peasants. They were tasked with articulating the collective will of their constituents and finding a way to forge consensus on crucial matters of state. The fundamental challenges they faced were immense: how to break free from centuries of tradition, how to assert their rights against the monarch's authority, and how to unite a fragmented Third Estate behind a common agenda. The procedural deadlock that ensued, particularly over the method of voting, whether by estate or by head, would soon ignite the revolutionary fire. When the Third Estate, frustrated by the intransigence of the privileged orders and the king's perceived attempts to control the proceedings, declared itself the National Assembly, it represented a bold procedural maneuver. This act of defiance, a declaration that they alone represented the true will of the French people, fundamentally altered the political landscape. The materials they utilized were not physical arms, but the weight of their collective representation and the legitimacy derived from the cahiers de doléances, which detailed widespread popular grievances. Their labor organization was now focused on legislative action, on drafting a new constitution and enacting reforms. The challenges remained formidable, including the need to legitimize their authority in the eyes of the populace and to overcome the king's resistance. But this assertion of self-governance was a profound step. It shifted the locus of power, suggesting that sovereignty could indeed reside with the people, not solely with the monarch.
The dramatic storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, a fortress prison that had become a potent symbol of royal despotism, marked a critical escalation into popular uprising. The technical processes of this momentous event involved the organized, though often chaotic, seizure of arms and gunpowder from the Hôtel des Invalides earlier in the day, followed by the assault on the Bastille itself. Crowds, driven by desperation for weapons and a burning desire to strike a blow against the monarchy, converged on the fortress. The materials of this popular action included makeshift weapons, farming implements, and the sheer force of numbers. The labor organization was entirely spontaneous and decentralized, a testament to the widespread discontent that could mobilize thousands without formal command. The challenges inherent in such an uncoordinated action were significant, but its symbolic impact was undeniable, demonstrating that the common people were willing to use force to assert their demands. This event, along with the subsequent great fear across the countryside, where peasants attacked manor houses and destroyed feudal records, underscored how economic hardship and a deep-seated sense of injustice could manifest as raw, unmediated collective action. Following these tumultuous events, a period of constructive, yet still volatile, reform emerged, epitomized by the National Assembly's work on the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This foundational document, inspired by Enlightenment ideals and the American Declaration of Independence, articulated core principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The technical processes involved in its drafting, rigorous debate, and eventual promulgation represented a new form of governance, one based on reasoned deliberation and codified law. The materials for this endeavor were the abstract philosophical concepts of natural rights, translated into concrete legal statutes and pronouncements.
The labor organization shifted from popular protest to systematic legislative work, with committees formed to dismantle the archaic institutions of the Ancien Régime and build a new national framework. The challenges were significant, including resistance from the entrenched nobility and clergy who saw their privileges threatened, and the sheer complexity of reorganizing centuries of administrative and social structures. This phase demonstrated a conscious, systematic effort to rebuild society upon new, rational principles, a stark contrast to the spontaneous eruption of the Bastille.
King Louis XVI's attempted flight from France in June 1791, a desperate bid to escape the revolutionary currents, profoundly altered the course of the revolution. The technical processes involved in this clandestine operation were detailed. Meticulous planning of routes, the use of disguises, and the reliance on loyalist communications to ensure safe passage. The materials included the royal carriages, altered to appear less conspicuous, and the essential but ultimately flawed network of communications. The labor organization was a small, highly secretive effort undertaken by a few trusted individuals set against the backdrop of a nation in constant flux. The primary challenges were the king's lack of genuine popular support, the effectiveness of the revolutionary intelligence network, and, crucially, the king's own indecisiveness and tendency towards hesitation. His capture at Varennes, which exposed his lack of commitment to the constitutional monarchy he had ostensibly accepted, irrevocably damaged his credibility and widened the chasm between those who still envisioned a role for the monarchy and those who now clamored for a republic. It proved, quite dramatically, how a single, ill-fated operation could fundamentally reorient political aspirations. The declaration of the First French Republic in September 1792 marked a decisive break from monarchy, a radical shift propelled by a volatile mix of external threats and internal political machinations. The pressures of war against Austria and Prussia, nations concerned about the spread of revolutionary ideas, created an atmosphere of crisis and suspicion. Within France, intense political rivalries between factions like the Girondins, who favored a more moderate approach, and the Jacobins, who advocated for more radical measures, intensified the struggle for control. The technical processes of this period involved sophisticated political maneuvering, the use of revolutionary propaganda to stir patriotic fervor, and the establishment of new governing bodies like the National Convention, which replaced the Legislative Assembly. The materials available were the potent force of patriotic sentiment, the evolving structures of revolutionary committees, and the nascent, often ill-equipped citizen armies being organized for defense. The labor organization now encompassed the mass mobilization of citizens from military service and the fierce ideological debates within political clubs and the convention itself. The challenges were multifaceted. The existential threat of foreign invasion demanded unity, while internal dissent and ideological divisions threatened to tear the nascent republic apart, illustrating how external pressures can amplify internal political radicalization. Amidst these tumultuous times, the Committee of Public Safety emerged as the de facto executive government during the revolution's most radical phase, wielding immense power. The technical processes overseen by this committee were vast, encompassing the coordination of national defense, the implementation of stringent economic controls, such as the law of the maximum, which fixed prices on essential goods, and the systematic suppression of any perceived enemies of the revolution. The materials they utilized included countless decrees, detailed surveillance reports, and, most chillingly, the instruments of revolutionary justice employed against those deemed counter-revolutionaries. The labor organization was highly centralized and hierarchical, with members of the committee directing various subcommittees and representatives on mission who carried out their directives across the provinces.
The primary challenges they faced were the overwhelming demands of a nation at war and the pervasive internal dissent, which ultimately led to the systematic deployment of terror as a deliberate political tool to maintain control and enforce ideological conformity. This era stands as a stark example of a highly organized yet profoundly brutal method of state control. The Reign of Terror, a period characterized by extreme state-sanctioned violence, was largely implemented through the machinery of the revolutionary tribunals. The technical processes of arrest, trial, and execution were streamlined, often to the point of perversion, with little regard for due process or established legal norms. The definition of an enemy of the revolution became increasingly broad, encompassing a wide range of individuals, from suspected royalists to those perceived as insufficiently zealous in their revolutionary commitment. The materials central to this apparatus included lists of suspects compiled through denunciations, the pronouncements of the tribunals, and the omnipresent guillotine, which served as a stark, efficient symbol of revolutionary retribution. The labor organization involved a network of judges, accusers, juries, and executioners, all operating under the overarching directives of the Committee of Public Safety. The principal challenges were the profound perversion of justice, the pervasive climate of fear that stifled any dissent, and the immense human cost of this systematic campaign of state-sponsored violence. This period powerfully illustrates how unchecked centralized power can lead to the systematic violation of fundamental human rights, a critical lesson for any system of governance.
The economic policies enacted during the Revolution, particularly the law of the maximum and the management of the assignat, a form of paper currency backed by the value of confiscated church lands, reveal the immense difficulty in controlling a complex economy during times of extreme upheaval. The technical processes of price controls, the requisitioning of goods from farmers and merchants, and the constant efforts to stabilize the rapidly depreciating currency were fraught with difficulty. The materials involved were the actual agricultural produce and manufactured goods, as well as the assignat notes themselves, which saw their value plummet due to overissuance and a lack of confidence. The labor organization required extensive participation from farmers, forced to sell their goods at fixed prices, shopkeepers struggling to comply with regulations, and government officials tasked with implementing and enforcing these often unpopular measures. The primary challenges included rampant inflation, persistent shortages of goods, the flourishing of a black market, and the widespread resentment generated by these economic interventions. It's worth noting that the initial idea behind the assignat was sound, but its execution became a source of great economic instability. The revolutionary armies transformed from a professional, albeit depleted force into vast citizen militias required a significant overhaul in labor organization and technical processes. The concept of the levée en masse, or mass conscription, dramatically increased troop numbers, necessitating new methods for training, equipping, and supplying these citizen soldiers. The materials of this transformed military included standardized uniforms, mass-produced muskets, and the intricate logistical networks required for their sustenance, from food and ammunition to medical care. The challenges were immense, rapidly training vast numbers of recruits, many of whom had little prior military experience, providing adequate and consistent supplies across immense distances, and maintaining morale in the face of constant brutal conflict. The revolutionary government reorganized military command structures, promoting officers based on merit rather than birth, and developed new tactical strategies designed to leverage the sheer numbers and revolutionary zeal of their forces. The effectiveness of these citizen armies in defending the Republic against the combined might of European monarchies stands as a testament to this remarkable organizational transformation, a process that historians continue to debate regarding its precise impact on military doctrine. The fall of Maximilien Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror, an event known as the Thermidorian reaction, ushered in a new phase characterized by a shift in control and a desire for stability. The technical processes involved in Robespierre's downfall were swift and brutal, culminating in his arrest and execution, along with his closest allies, on July 28, 1794. This was followed by the establishment of the Directory, a new five-man executive body intended to provide more stable governance. The materials that facilitated this transition included the shifting alliances within the National Convention, as many who had supported the terror now sought to distance themselves from its excesses, and the overwhelming popular desire for an end to the bloodshed and uncertainty. The labor organization saw a return to more conventional political structures, though factionalism and political instability remained significant challenges. The Directory struggled to manage the lingering psychological effects of the terror, continue the ongoing wars, and address internal political divisions, illustrating how even radical movements can experience internal reversals and attempts to re-establish order, often with their own set of difficulties. The ascent of Napoleon Bonaparte from a distinguished general to a dominant political figure represents a pivotal moment in the revolution's trajectory. His military successes, particularly in Italy and Egypt, coupled with his ability to cultivate a powerful public image, provided him with immense political capital. The technical processes of his rise involved brilliant military campaigns, innovative strategies that often outmaneuvered his opponents, and a keen understanding of how to leverage his popularity to his advantage. The materials he commanded included loyal and battle-hardened armies, whose victories he strategically publicized, and the growing public weariness with the Directory's perceived ineffectiveness and corruption. The labor organization under Napoleon began to exhibit a clear shift towards military discipline and centralized command, a style that proved highly effective in achieving objectives. The challenges he faced were the continued external threats posed by European coalitions and the intricate internal political maneuvering required to consolidate his authority and ultimately seize power. His coup d'état on November 9, 1799, known as the 18th Brumaire, marked a significant turning point, demonstrating how military leadership could emerge from the chaos of revolution and establish a new form of authority. The period of the consulate, with Napoleon as first consul, saw a remarkable consolidation of power and the implementation of significant reforms that reshaped French society. The technical processes involved a systematic reorganization of the nation's administration, the stabilization of its finances through the establishment of the Bank of France, and the monumental creation of the Napoleonic Code. This codified body of law, drawing from Roman law and revolutionary principles, aimed to create a unified, accessible, and equitable legal system across France. The materials for this legal overhaul included the existing, often contradictory legal framework, which Napoleon and his jurists systematically revised, codified, and standardized. The labor organization was now directed by a strong, centralized executive, with a pronounced emphasis on efficiency, order, and the implementation of national policies. The challenges included consolidating his authority, navigating the complex political landscape inherited from the revolution, and projecting an image of stability and strength. The Napoleonic Code, in particular, had a profound and lasting impact, shaping legal systems not only in France but across much of Europe, demonstrating the enduring power of well-structured legal frameworks. The documentation of the era reveals layers of meaning that scholars still examine.
The Committee of Public Safety now held the reins of France, a body tasked with guiding the Republic through its most perilous hours. This council, composed of men like Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer known for his unyielding principles, and Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, a fervent ideologue, operated not as a legislative body in the traditional sense, but as a powerful executive engine. Their mandate was broad: to defend the revolution against internal and external enemies, and to ensure the Republic's survival by any means necessary. The materials they worked with were not mere paper and ink, but the very fabric of a nation under siege. Surveillance reports detailing whispered dissent, decrees that reshaped daily life, and, chillingly, the lists of those deemed threats to the new order.
The technical processes employed by the committee were as systematic as they were far-reaching, designed to exert control over every aspect of French society. Central to their strategy was the concept of governing by decree, meaning their pronouncements carried the force of law without the need for prolonged debate or approval by other assemblies. This allowed for swift action, whether it was mobilizing resources for the war effort or enacting economic measures. The coordination of this vast administrative network required constant communication and delegation, with subcommittees handling specific areas like finance, war, and police. This intricate labor organization aimed to create a unified national will, directing the efforts of millions towards a single purpose: the preservation of the Republic. The committee's authority was further cemented by the appointment of representatives on mission, individuals sent to the provinces and the armies to enforce revolutionary laws and ensure loyalty. These representatives acted with considerable power, often commanding troops, overseeing local administrations, and even passing judgment. They were the eyes and ears of the committee, equipped with extensive powers to arrest, requisition, and enforce compliance. The materials they utilized included detailed instructions from Paris, local census data, and reports from informants, all channeled back to the committee to inform their decisions. This decentralization of authority, paradoxically, served to centralize control, creating a pervasive network of oversight across the nation. This systematic approach, however, was not without immense challenges. The sheer scale of the territory and the ongoing wars meant that communication was often slow and information incomplete. Moreover, the constant need to root out opposition required an ever-vigilant and often suspicious approach to governance. The committee's members were acutely aware that any wavering in their resolve could be exploited by enemies both within France and from abroad. The very urgency of their task, the perceived existential threat to the Republic, fueled a relentless pace of decision-making and action, often with little time for deliberation. A critical instrument of their control was the implementation of economic regulations, most notably the Law of the Maximum. This decree aimed to fix the prices of essential goods and wages, a measure intended to combat inflation and ensure that the army and the urban poor had access to necessities. The technical processes involved in setting these prices required complex calculations based on regional production costs and transportation. Shopkeepers and farmers were required to display prices and sell at these set rates, under penalty of severe punishment. This direct intervention in the market was a radical departure from previous economic practices, reflecting the committee's belief in the state's right to manage the economy for the common good. The materials of this economic control were the goods themselves: grain, firewood, textiles, and the like, which were subject to requisitioning if not sold at the mandated prices.
Farmers and producers found themselves increasingly frustrated by being forced to sell their labor and produce at rates they considered unfair, particularly when their own costs were rising. This created a significant tension, driving much of the rural population away from full support of the revolutionary government, as their daily lives were directly impacted by these decrees. The committee's aim was to create a stable economic foundation for the war effort, but the practical execution proved deeply divisive. The committee's reach extended to the organization of the nation's defense, a paramount concern given the ongoing conflicts with European powers. The concept of the levée en masse, or mass conscription, was actively implemented, calling upon all able-bodied men to serve the Republic. This required a massive labor organization to equip, train, and provision these new citizen soldiers. The materials for this were vast. Thousands of muskets, cannon, uniforms, and immense quantities of food and medical supplies had to be procured and distributed. The logistical challenges of outfitting an army that grew exponentially were staggering, demanding efficient factories, streamlined transportation, and dedicated administrators. This mobilization was not merely about numbers, it was also about fostering a new kind of soldier, one driven by revolutionary ideals rather than royal loyalty. The committee encouraged patriotic fervor through propaganda, festivals, and public pronouncements, seeking to imbue these citizen armies with a fierce dedication to the Republic. The challenges were manifold, from the initial lack of experienced officers and standardized training to the constant struggle to provide adequate resources to troops often operating in difficult conditions. Yet, despite these hurdles, the revolutionary armies began to demonstrate a remarkable resilience and effectiveness on the battlefield. Within the government itself, the labor organization of the Committee of Public Safety evolved to manage the diverse demands placed upon it. Members specialized in different areas, with figures like Jean-Marie Collot d'Herbois focusing on the armies and the suppression of internal dissent, and Bertrand Barrère acting as a primary spokesman and propagandist. The sheer volume of correspondence, reports, and decrees required a dedicated administrative staff. The materials they handled included not only official documents, but also private letters and denunciations, which fed into the committee's surveillance apparatus and contributed to the pervasive atmosphere of suspicion that characterized this period. The committee's control mechanisms extended to the justice system, with the establishment and empowerment of the revolutionary tribunals. These courts were created to swiftly try those accused of counter-revolutionary activities, and their proceedings were markedly different from those of traditional legal bodies. The technical processes involved simplified procedures, often with limited rights for the accused and a broad definition of what constituted an enemy of the Republic. The materials used in these tribunals included denunciations from citizens, lists of suspects compiled by committees, and the testimony of witnesses, all presented before judges who were expected to act with revolutionary zeal. This judicial system, while intended to expedite justice and remove perceived threats, led to a significant expansion of state power over individual lives. The challenges inherent in such a system included the potential for abuse, the erosion of due process, and the creation of a climate of fear, where even innocent actions could be misconstrued. The committee justified these measures as necessary for the Republic's survival, arguing that in times of extreme crisis, extraordinary means were required to preserve the greater good. Yet, the sheer volume of arrests and executions would eventually become a significant point of contention. The committee's actions, though often brutal, were driven by a profound belief in the necessity of their mission to forge a new society. They saw themselves as surgeons, making difficult, even painful incisions to save the body politic from corruption and decay. This conviction, coupled with the immense pressures of war and internal unrest, shaped their approach to governance, leading to a highly centralized and often uncompromising administration. The systematic application of their will across France reflects a pivotal moment where revolutionary ideology met the practical demands of statecraft, shaping the future of governance. This centralized control, born from crisis, reflects universal human responses to profound societal pressures. The chill that accompanied the sharpening of the guillotine blades was not entirely from the dawn mist rising from the Seine. It was a different kind of cold, one that settled deep within the bones, a consequence of the relentless machinery of justice that now defined Paris. For those tasked with its operation, the mornings began with a methodical assessment of the day's docket, a process governed by the stern pronouncements emanating from the Committee of Public Safety. Officials, their faces etched with a weariness that transcended simple fatigue, would gather in dimly lit rooms, the scent of damp paper and stale ink a constant companion, to review the latest lists of names, meticulously compiled from denunciations and wartime surveillance. This structured approach to identifying and processing perceived enemies of the revolution was the central technical process of this period, a system designed for efficiency, albeit a chilling one. The materials at hand for these tribunals were varied, ranging from hastily scribbled accusations delivered by fearful citizens to more detailed reports from neighborhood watch committees, known as comités révolutionnaires. These local bodies acted as the eyes and ears of the Committee of Public Safety, their work often fueled by suspicion and a desire to demonstrate loyalty through vigilance. One might find a neighbor's complaint about hoarding bread, perhaps written on a scrap of brown paper, placed alongside a more official report detailing seditious conversations overheard in a public square. The texture of these documents, from the rough paper of personal grievances to the smoother official parchment of government directives, spoke volumes about the diverse sources of information that fed the revolutionary judicial system. Such a system required careful organization, ensuring that each piece of paper, each accusation, was properly logged and considered within the prevailing legal framework, however broadly interpreted. The labor organization of the revolutionary tribunals was complex, involving a chain of command that extended from the Committee of Public Safety down to the individual judges, jurors, and clerks. Judges, often men with legal backgrounds but now deeply entrenched in revolutionary fervor, presided over proceedings that bore little resemblance to earlier legal traditions. Jurors, selected for their revolutionary zeal, were tasked with determining guilt based on broad categories of enemies of the people. The clerks meticulously recorded testimonies and verdicts, their steady hands creating the official record of each trial. This entire apparatus operated under the principle of summary justice, meaning trials were often swift, intended to swiftly remove perceived threats to the Republic, thereby consolidating the power of the committee. This intense focus on swiftness presented a significant challenge, as the sheer volume of cases often outstripped the capacity for thorough investigation. The challenges faced by these tribunals were not merely procedural, they were deeply rooted in the pervasive climate of fear that gripped the nation. The definition of an enemy of the revolution was fluid, encompassing not only active counter-revolutionaries, but also those suspected of insufficient revolutionary ardor, or even those simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This broad interpretation meant that the system, intended to protect the Republic, could inadvertently ensnare innocent individuals. The constant pressure to demonstrate revolutionary commitment meant that denunciations, even those based on flimsy evidence or personal vendettas, were often treated with gravity. Such a situation created a difficult environment for those within the system, forcing them to navigate a treacherous path between upholding revolutionary ideals and succumbing to the excesses of paranoia. Consider the case of a merchant, Pierre Dubois, whose offense was allegedly selling flour at a price slightly above the legally mandated maximum price, a regulation designed to control inflation and ensure fair distribution of essential goods. His accuser, a disgruntled former employee with whom he had a bitter falling out over wages, presented testimony suggesting deliberate profiteering. The tribunal, operating under the directive to punish economic sabotage as an act of treason, viewed this as a grave offense. The technical process involved examining the merchant's ledgers and comparing them against the maximum price regulations, a task made more difficult by the rapid depreciation of the ascent, the revolutionary paper currency, which rendered fixed prices increasingly impractical. The merchant, unaware of the full extent of the accusation until the trial, found himself in a desperate situation, his defense hampered by the swiftness of the proceedings.
The lack of due process became a significant concern as the terror intensified. Unlike earlier legal systems that emphasized rigorous proof and the right to a robust defense, the revolutionary tribunals often operated with a presumption of guilt for those accused of counter-revolutionary activities. The law of suspects, enacted in September 1793, allowed for the arrest of individuals based on vague criteria, further expanding the pool of potential defendants. This created a widespread feeling of unease, as anyone could become a target. The materials of accusation thus shifted from concrete evidence of wrongdoing to subjective interpretations of loyalty and intent. This broad net cast by the tribunals meant that the organization of labor within the court system was constantly strained, as clerks struggled to process the sheer volume of individuals brought before them, their desks piled high with the paperwork of apprehension. The sensory details of these proceedings painted a stark picture. The courtroom itself, often a repurposed church or public building, echoed with the stern voices of the judges and the nervous pronouncements of the accused. The air within these spaces could feel close, not from oppressive heat, but from the sheer density of people gathered. The officials, the defendants, the spectators drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity and revolutionary fervor. The rough texture of wooden benches where the accused waited their turn, the smell of unwashed wool garments on those who had been recently apprehended, all contributed to the somber atmosphere. Even the distinctive, almost metallic scent that sometimes clung to those who had spent time in prison cells was a palpable element of the experience, a constant reminder of the stakes involved. One particularly unusual aspect of this period was the use of public denunciations as a primary tool for identifying suspected enemies. In many Parisian neighborhoods, citizens were encouraged to report any suspicious activity or individuals who failed to display sufficient revolutionary enthusiasm. This created a social pressure cooker where neighbors watched neighbors, and a misplaced word or an unenthusiastic cheer could lead to a formal accusation. The materials for these denunciations were often personal, written in hurried script on any available paper, and their very abundance presented a logistical challenge for the committees responsible for processing them. This informal labor organization, driven by the populace itself, amplified the reach of the Committee of Public Safety's control mechanisms. The ongoing scholarly debate centers on the extent to which the terror was a centrally directed, systematic policy versus a more localized, emergent phenomenon, driven by fear and wartime pressures. While the Committee of Public Safety certainly provided the overarching framework and many of the directives, the decentralized nature of the Comité Révolutionnaire and the pervasive influence of popular sentiment suggest a more complex reality. The sheer volume of accusations and the varying degrees of severity in sentencing across different regions hint at a system that was both directed from above and shaped by the conditions on the ground, illustrating a dynamic interplay between central authority and local initiative in the implementation of revolutionary justice. The technical processes of executing the sentences were equally systematized.
The guillotine, a relatively new invention designed for swift and equal execution regardless of social standing, became the ubiquitous symbol of revolutionary justice. The labor organization required to operate this apparatus was highly specialized, involving skilled executioners and their assistants who maintained the machine and prepared it for each day's work. The materials here were the heavy wooden structure, the sharp angled blade, and the wicker basket that received the fallen heads. This efficiency of execution, while intended to embody the revolution's commitment to equality, also contributed to the chilling regularity with which lives were extinguished. The transition from the previous chapter, which detailed the Committee of Public Safety's broad directives and the organization of revolutionary armies, to this focus on the judicial mechanisms represents a shift from the strategic direction of the state to the micro-level enforcement of its will. While the levée en masse created the citizen armies that defended the Republic, it also expanded the perceived need for internal control, as such a large mobilized population could harbor potential dissent. The economic policies, like the law of the maximum, while aimed at stabilizing the nation, also created new grounds for prosecution, as any failure to comply could be construed as sabotage. Thus, the very mechanisms designed to strengthen the Republic simultaneously fueled the machinery of the terror. The daily reality for many was the constant awareness of these tribunals. People learned to modulate their conversations, to be cautious in their associations, and to express their opinions carefully. This adaptation was a direct response to the system of control, demonstrating how human behavior is shaped by the prevailing legal and social structures. The pervasive sense of being watched, coupled with the knowledge that even minor infractions could lead to severe consequences, created a profound psychological impact. The sheer volume of individuals processed through these tribunals and the speed with which sentences were carried out meant that the revolution was not just a political or military upheaval, but a deeply personal experience for countless French citizens, marked by uncertainty and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. This discussion has illuminated the intricate judicial machinery of the revolutionary tribunals, detailing their systematic processes, the varied materials of accusation, the complex labor organization, and the significant challenges posed by the climate of fear, and the broad definition of enemies of the revolution, highlighting the societal adaptations and the ongoing debate regarding the terror's systematic nature. The operations of the revolutionary tribunals have been established as a core component of the Committee of Public Safety strategy, processing individuals under broad definitions of counter-revolutionary activity, creating a pervasive atmosphere of caution throughout French society. The economic landscape of revolutionary France became a complex tapestry, woven with bold attempts to manage prices and a rapidly devaluing currency. Following the upheaval that saw the collapse of old structures, the newly formed government faced immense pressure to stabilize the market and ensure the availability of essential goods for a population grappling with both scarcity and inflation. These efforts, particularly the implementation of price controls and the management of paper money, revealed the profound challenges of redirecting a national economy in crisis, demonstrating how even well-intentioned policies could create unintended consequences, a lesson relevant to economic governance across centuries. To address the growing concern over soaring prices, a decree known as the Law of the Maximum was introduced, attempting to fix the cost of essential items and services. This meant that vendors could not legally charge more than the stipulated price for bread, salt, and other vital commodities, a measure intended to protect the common citizen from the hardships of hyperinflation. The materials impacted by this law were widespread, encompassing everything from agricultural produce brought to market by farmers to manufactured goods produced by artisans and nascent industries. This attempt to regulate the market involved a considerable labor organization of officials, tasked with enforcing the price ceilings, inspecting shops, and investigating any suspected violations, creating a new layer of bureaucratic activity within the revolutionary administration. The implementation of the law of the maximum was far from simple, presenting significant challenges for both the producers and the consumers. Farmers, for instance, found themselves compelled to sell their harvests at prices that often did not cover their costs of production, particularly after facing unpredictable weather and the general disruption of wartime. Consequently, many chose to withhold goods from official markets, leading to shortages in cities and a thriving black market where prices were dictated by supply and demand rather than government decree. This created a difficult dilemma for ordinary people. While the law aimed to make necessities affordable, the resulting scarcity meant that goods were often simply unavailable at any price through official channels, forcing individuals to seek less legitimate means of acquisition. This situation was further complicated by the proliferation of the assignat, a form of paper money initially backed by the confiscated assets of the church and émigré nobles. These notes were intended to fund the government and stimulate economic activity, but as their numbers increased and confidence in the state wavered, their value began to plummet. The technical processes of printing vast quantities of assignats were straightforward, but the economic reality was that their worth diminished with every new issue, a classic case of too much money chasing too few goods. This depreciation meant that savings were eroded and the cost of living, despite the maximum, continued to climb for those who relied on the official currency.
The government's response to the depreciating assignat involved further interventions, including attempts to enforce its circulation at face value and even to issue decrees that made it illegal to refuse them in payment. However, the market forces of inflation proved remarkably resilient, and the paper money continued its downward spiral in value. The materials of exchange became increasingly unreliable, leading people to hoard hard currency, such as gold and silver coins, or to resort to barter, especially in rural areas where the reach of government enforcement was less pronounced. This created a dual economy, where official transactions were conducted with worthless paper, while crucial exchanges happened through informal networks and at much higher unofficial valuations. The labor organization of daily life was profoundly affected by these economic policies. Shopkeepers found themselves in a precarious position, caught between the legal requirement to sell at the maximum and the economic reality of acquiring goods at higher prices, or facing confiscation of their wares if they did not comply. Many artisans and small producers struggled to source raw materials at prices that allowed them to continue their craft, leading to a decline in production and a general atmosphere of economic uncertainty. The challenges inherent in managing such a volatile economic environment required constant adaptation and a significant expenditure of government resources for enforcement and control, often at the expense of other pressing needs. Beyond the direct price controls, the revolutionary government also implemented requisitioning orders, demanding specific quantities of goods from farmers and producers for the use of the armies and the state. This practice, while intended to secure vital supplies for the war effort and internal stability, further strained agricultural production and the availability of goods for the civilian population. The materials thus diverted were critical foodstuffs and raw materials, effectively redirecting resources from the general populace to the war machine and governmental operations. This process highlights a fundamental tension. The need to fund a revolution and its extensive military operations often came at the direct expense of the economic well-being of the very citizens the revolution claimed to serve. The societal impact of these economic measures was substantial. While some segments of the population, particularly urban workers who benefited from fixed bread prices, may have initially seen some relief, the overall effect was one of disruption and hardship for many. The constant struggle to obtain goods, the uncertainty of the currency's value, and the increasing prevalence of unofficial dealings created an environment of anxiety and mistrust. The challenges were not merely economic, but also social, as these policies contributed to a sense of unfairness and a growing disconnect between the government's pronouncements and the lived realities of the people. This period underscores how economic management during times of profound societal change requires not only technical understanding, but also a keen awareness of the human element and the motivations that drive individual behavior in a market. The government's efforts to stabilize the economy through the law of the maximum and the control of the ascent represented a highly centralized and interventionist approach to economic management. This was a direct consequence of the revolutionary government's perceived need to exert absolute control over resources and prices to ensure the survival of the republic against both internal dissent and external threats. The technical processes involved in such extensive state intervention were unprecedented, requiring a vast bureaucratic apparatus to monitor, regulate, and enforce compliance across the entire nation, a significant undertaking given the communication and transportation limitations of the era. Considering the immense difficulty in managing a nation's economy during such a tumultuous period, how did these policies, designed to protect the populace, inadvertently create conditions that fueled further discontent and economic instability? The evidence from this period of economic experimentation continues to inform scholarly understanding of the complex interplay between state control and market forces. The French Republic, finding itself threatened by neighboring monarchies, faced a stark need to replenish its depleted ranks and marshal its citizen body for defense. This imperative drove a fundamental shift in military organization, transforming a professional, albeit diminished, force into a vast citizen army, a process requiring immense logistical and organizational innovation. The concept of the levée en masse, or mass conscription, emerged as the primary mechanism for this mobilization, demanding an unprecedented organization of the nation's manpower. This broad call to arms meant that men from all walks of life, from farmers to artisans, were expected to contribute to the war effort, a profound societal undertaking that reshaped daily life across France. The materials required for such a massive undertaking were substantial and varied, stretching the Republic's resources to their limit. Clothing the vast new army involved a frantic effort to procure or manufacture uniforms, often simple, functional woolen coats and breeches, with variations in color and insignia, sometimes reflecting regional origins or specific units. The provision of weaponry presented a considerable challenge. While some muskets were seized from royal armories or captured from enemies, many citizen soldiers were equipped with a mix of older firearms, pikes, and even farm implements converted for combat. Furthermore, the logistical network for supplying this citizen force with food, ammunition, and medical care was a nascent, often strained enterprise, relying on requisitioning, rudimentary supply depots, and the arduous efforts of civilian wagoners. The labor organization of the revolutionary armies was a complex, evolving system, moving away from the hierarchical structures of the old royal army towards a more meritocratic, though often chaotic model. While experienced officers from the Ancien Régime were initially retained, many were purged or fled, leading to a rapid promotion of talented individuals from the ranks, often based on battlefield performance rather than pedigree. This created a dynamic,
sometimes volatile command structure, where bravery and tactical acumen were highly valued. The support roles, too, were reconfigured. Blacksmiths were tasked with repairing weapons, cobblers with mending boots, and women often served as vivandières, following the armies to provide sustenance and care, a vital, often unsung contribution to maintaining the fighting force. However, the sheer scale of the levée en masse presented considerable challenges, not least of which was training and equipping millions of men with little to no prior military experience. The process of transforming civilians into soldiers was arduous, often conducted with limited resources and under constant threat. Uniformity in training was difficult to achieve, leading to varied levels of discipline and effectiveness in different units. Moreover, the provision of adequate provisions and ammunition proved a persistent problem. Soldiers frequently endured shortages, relying on foraging or the goodwill of local populations, which could also breed resentment. It was not uncommon for troops to march without adequate footwear or sufficient rations, a testament to the immense strain placed upon the Republic's nascent logistical capabilities.
This period saw the introduction of innovative, if sometimes brutal, methods for maintaining troop morale and discipline. The revolutionary government understood that a citizen army fighting for ideals rather than simply for a monarch needed constant ideological reinforcement. This involved the widespread dissemination of patriotic pamphlets, the performance of revolutionary songs and plays, and the establishment of political commissars within units to ensure loyalty and indoctrinate soldiers in the revolutionary spirit. Yet, alongside this ideological fervor, severe punishments were meted out for desertion, insubordination, or perceived disloyalty, often through summary trials or execution by firing squad, reflecting the harsh realities of maintaining order in a revolutionary military. The administrative task of registering and deploying these vast numbers of conscripts was an enormous undertaking, requiring the creation of new administrative bodies at both national and local levels. Local officials, often newly appointed and inexperienced, were tasked with compiling lists of eligible men, organizing their assembly, and ensuring they reported for duty. This decentralized approach, while necessary to manage the scale of the operation, also introduced inefficiencies and variations in implementation. Occasionally, local populations would attempt to protect their own by misrepresenting numbers or providing exemptions, highlighting the persistent tension between national demands and local interests. It is perhaps a testament to the revolutionary fervor that, despite these obstacles, millions did eventually answer the call to arms. One particularly striking aspect of this military transformation was the integration of various regional militias and volunteer corps into the national army, a process that often involved merging distinct traditions and rivalries. For instance, the fédérés, volunteers from provincial cities and towns, brought with them their own particular identities and modes of organization. The government sought to imbue these diverse groups with a common sense of national purpose, emphasizing their shared identity as French citizens fighting for liberty and equality. This blending of regional pride with national identity was a delicate balancing act, aimed at fostering unity while harnessing the existing communal loyalties. The development of military logistics also saw significant advancements, driven by necessity. The French army pioneered more efficient methods for supplying large formations, including the use of standardized requisitioning forms and the establishment of regional supply depots. However, the implementation of the assignat, the revolutionary paper currency, as the primary medium of exchange for military purchases led to rampant inflation, making the actual cost of supplies increasingly unpredictable.
This economic instability often meant that contracts for goods and services were subject to constant renegotiation, adding another layer of complexity to the already strained logistical system. It's a curious detail that while the army struggled with paper money, the very act of requisitioning often meant payments were made in kind, with goods and even land being seized directly. A particularly thorny challenge that historians still debate is the exact balance between ideological motivation and coercive pressure in filling the ranks of the Revolutionary Army. While patriotic fervor undoubtedly played a significant role, historical accounts also document instances of forced conscription, the use of bounty hunters to fill quotas, and severe penalties for evasion. The effectiveness of the army, therefore, can be seen as a product of both willing participation and state-imposed obligation, a complex interplay that fueled the Republic's military successes against formidable odds. The very notion of a citizen's duty to the nation was being redefined, and the army became the crucible where this new concept was forged. The transformation of France into an armed republic capable of mobilizing millions was a monumental achievement. The labor organization, the procurement of materials, and the overcoming of myriad challenges all point to a systematic effort to reorient a nation towards total war. This period highlights how a society, when galvanized by a powerful ideology and facing existential threats, can radically reorganize its fundamental structures to meet unprecedented demands, a lesson that echoes through centuries of human conflict and national endeavor. These methods demonstrate recurrent patterns in how nations marshal their people in times of existential crisis. The National Convention, exhausted by the ceaseless demands of war and internal strife, sought a respite from the suffocating grip of the Committee of Public Safety. It was a palpable shift, a collective exhale after a period of intense, suffocating pressure. Across Paris, the air, which had often stung the eyes from the constant presence of smoke and fear, seemed to clear slightly, allowing a clearer view of the immediate future. This transition began not with a grand pronouncement, but with a series of calculated moves, a quiet unraveling of the established order. The powerful pronouncements that had dictated every aspect of life for months suddenly lost their immediate sting, replaced by a cautious appraisal of what might come next. The very materials of governance, the decrees, the denunciations, the lists of suspects, were no longer the sole focus, though their shadow remained long. The removal of Maximilien Robespierre, the fervent architect of the Terror, from his position of influence marked a critical turning point. Historical accounts describe the scene within the convention as a mixture of relief and trepidation. Deputies, many of whom had lived under the constant threat of accusation, found themselves navigating a new, uncertain political landscape. The technical processes involved in his arrest were surprisingly swift, a testament to the weariness of those who had been his allies and the courage of those who had opposed him. This action itself was a powerful statement, a rejection of the unchecked power that had been wielded for so long. The labor organization of the government, so rigidly controlled by the committee, began to loosen, allowing for a more diverse range of voices to emerge, though many still spoke with caution, mindful of past repercussions. Following this dramatic upheaval, the convention moved to dismantle the instruments of the Terror. Revolutionary tribunals, which had operated with such swift and often arbitrary justice, were reorganized and their powers curtailed. The materials used by these tribunals, the denunciations, the often flimsy evidence, were now scrutinized with a new, critical eye. The public, having witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of unchecked power, expressed a deep yearning for stability and a return to more predictable forms of governance. This desire for order, after years of radical upheaval, was a powerful force shaping the immediate aftermath, influencing the decisions made by those who sought to guide the nation forward. The sheer exhaustion from the constant state of alert had left many craving a less demanding, more settled existence. This desire for stability
paved the way for the establishment of the Directory, a new governing structure. The technical processes of creating this five-man executive body involved intricate political maneuvering and the negotiation of power among various factions within the convention. The labor organization of the state shifted once more, attempting to balance the need for firm leadership with the aversion to the centralized despotism experienced under the Committee of Public Safety. The materials of this new government included a revised constitution, designed to prevent any single individual or group from accumulating excessive authority. However, the challenges were immediate. Navigating a nation deeply scarred by years of internal conflict and facing continued external threats from coalitions of European monarchies. The period of the Directory, though intended to bring order, proved to be a time of considerable political instability and economic hardship. Factionalism remained a persistent issue, with different groups vying for influence and control. The challenges faced by the Directory included managing a still fragile economy, dealing with widespread corruption, and attempting to maintain the support of a populace weary of constant political turmoil. The materials of governance at this time were often characterized by a lack of consensus and a reliance on military force to quell internal dissent. The labor organization of the state struggled to implement effective policies, hampered by internal divisions and a public increasingly disillusioned with the political class. Furthermore, the continued state of war placed an immense strain on the nation's resources and its people. The citizen armies forged in the crucible of revolution continued to fight on multiple fronts, requiring constant attention to logistics and supply. The labor organization dedicated to supporting these armies faced immense pressure, ensuring the flow of essential materials like food, ammunition, and equipment. The challenges of maintaining such a vast military enterprise during a period of domestic instability were considerable, highlighting the ongoing tension between the need for national defense and the capacity for effective governance. The logistical networks, once established, required constant maintenance and adaptation to new operational demands. It was within this context of a struggling Directory and an increasingly influential military that certain figures began to rise. The exhaustion of the political class, coupled with the successes of French generals on the battlefield, created an environment ripe for new leadership. The materials available to ambitious military men included battlefield victories, the loyalty of their troops, and the public's perception of their effectiveness. The labor organization of the military offered a stark contrast to the often chaotic and fragmented political efforts of the Directory, presenting a model of discipline and decisive action. The challenges for any aspiring leader involved navigating the complex political landscape while also projecting an image of strength and stability. One such figure was Napoleon Bonaparte, a general whose military acumen and ambition began to capture the public's imagination. His campaigns, marked by strategic brilliance and efficient logistical planning, demonstrated a mastery of the technical processes of warfare and command. The materials he utilized were the disciplined soldiers he led and the innovative tactics he employed on the battlefield. The labor organization within his armies was characterized by a clear hierarchy and a direct chain of command, a system that proved highly effective. The challenges he faced were not only on the battlefield, but also in the political arena, where he began to build his influence. The weariness of the populace with the Directory's perceived weakness and inability to provide lasting stability created an opening. People, having endured years of revolutionary fervor and subsequent instability, sought a strong hand to guide the nation. The materials of public opinion, shaped by a desire for peace and order, began to favor decisive leadership.
The labor organization of society, from farmers to merchants, yearned for an environment where their efforts would not be constantly disrupted by political upheaval. The challenges for the Directory were immense, as they struggled to maintain control in the face of growing discontent and the rising popularity of military figures like Bonaparte.
The coup d'état of 18 Brumaire, orchestrated by Napoleon and his allies, represented a decisive shift in power. The technical processes involved in this seizure of authority were carefully planned, utilizing the military's influence and exploiting the Directory's internal weaknesses. The materials for this operation included loyal troops, influential political figures, and a narrative that emphasized the need for a strong, unified government. The labor organization of the conspiracy itself was compact and efficient, operating with a degree of secrecy and purpose that the Directory lacked. The challenges were to successfully transition from a coup to establishing a stable and legitimate form of rule, a task that would redefine the course of France. Such adaptations reveal the complex interplay of military strength and political opportunity in historical transition. The years following the dramatic upheaval of the Terror had settled into a new, yet still turbulent rhythm across France. The Directory, a 5-man executive council, now guided the nation, attempting to balance the fervent demands of the revolution with a yearning for order. Yet this new governance proved as unstable as the volatile currencies that flooded the markets, a persistent problem that complicated daily life and economic dealings. The assignats, those paper notes first introduced to fund the state, had depreciated so severely that bartering had become common, with people trading goods directly rather than relying on the increasingly worthless currency. Across the land, farmers found it more practical to exchange grain for salt or wool for iron tools than to accept the paper bills that lost value by the day. This economic fragility created an environment ripe for frustration, as many felt their revolutionary gains were being erased by the very government meant to protect them. Amidst this economic uncertainty, the military, however, found its footing, a stark contrast to the often fractured political landscape. Generals who had proven their mettle on the battlefield gained significant prestige, their victories a source of national pride in a land weary of internal strife. One such figure, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, had already distinguished himself in campaigns against Austria. His tactical brilliance, particularly his ability to rapidly move his troops and surprise his opponents, had earned him considerable renown. His campaigns in Italy especially had been remarkably successful, securing vital resources and territorial gains for France, which in turn boosted the Directory's legitimacy, however tenuously. The logistical challenges of equipping and supplying armies on distant frontiers had always been immense. Yet Napoleon's armies seemed unusually well provisioned, a testament to his innovative methods of foraging and requisitioning from occupied territories. This organization of supplies, often involving swift seizures of local resources, became a hallmark of his approach. The Directory, meanwhile, struggled with its own internal mechanics, a complex system of checks and balances that often resulted in paralysis rather than effective action. Electing new members every year and facing constant political infighting, the executive body found it difficult to enact decisive policies, especially those concerning the long-term stability of the nation. Their efforts to reform finances were hampered by this constant division, and attempts to control inflation were often undermined by political expediency. The materials at their disposal, the decrees, the existing governmental structures, and the public's dwindling faith seemed insufficient to mend the deep economic fissures. The very labor organization of the government, a committee-based system with shifting loyalties, prevented the kind of unified effort needed to address the pressing issues of the day, leaving many citizens feeling their sacrifices had been in vain. It was within this context of governmental weakness and military strength
that Napoleon's political ambitions began to visibly coalesce. While his military victories provided him with a powerful platform, his astute understanding of public opinion allowed him to cultivate an image of a decisive leader, capable of restoring order and prosperity. Reports from his campaigns, often carefully managed and disseminated, painted a picture of a heroic figure devoted to the glory of France, a narrative that resonated deeply with a populace yearning for stability. He understood the power of symbols and carefully curated his public appearances, projecting an aura of competence and unwavering resolve. This calculated presentation of himself as the nation's indispensable savior was a crucial technical process in his rise to power, far removed from the battlefields themselves. Furthermore, Napoleon's strategic use of propaganda played a vital role in shaping public perception. Newspapers and pamphlets, many secretly subsidized or influenced by his allies, lauded his achievements and subtly criticized the Directory's perceived incompetence. This dissemination of information, a key technical process of the era, allowed Napoleon to bypass traditional political channels and connect directly with the people. The materials of this campaign were ink, paper, and carefully crafted words, which proved far more persuasive than the Directory's often contradictory pronouncements. The labor organization behind this effort involved editors, printers, and word-of-mouth networks that spread his message throughout France, creating a powerful wave of popular support that the existing government could not match. This demonstrates how control over information can be as potent a force as military might. The internal political dynamics within the Directory provided Napoleon with further opportunities. The government faced numerous challenges, including royalist uprisings and Jacobin conspiracies, forcing them to rely increasingly on the military to maintain order. This reliance was a dangerous game, as it elevated the status and influence of generals like Napoleon, who possessed armies loyal to them personally, rather than solely to the state. The Directory's labor organization became increasingly dependent on military intervention to quell domestic disturbances, a clear sign of its weakening authority. This shift in power dynamics, where the sword began to dictate to the pen, created a situation where a successful general could realistically contemplate seizing political control. The materials of governance were slipping from civilian hands. A peculiar detail that sometimes surfaces in accounts from this period involves the meticulous cataloging of confiscated goods from conquered territories, with a portion often designated for the personal enrichment of commanding generals, a practice that, while not entirely novel, became notably pronounced under Napoleon. This aspect of military finance, intertwined with personal ambition, fueled his resources and ability to maintain a loyal following, blurring the lines between state service and private enterprise. The ongoing scholarly debate often centers on whether these financial arrangements were indicative of outright corruption or merely an accepted, albeit ethically gray, method of funding protracted military campaigns in an era of state bankruptcy, a question that continues to engage historians. The coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799 represented the culmination of these years of rising military influence and governmental instability. Napoleon, returning from a campaign in Egypt, found the Directory weakened and unpopular, and skillfully exploited this opportune moment. The technical processes involved in this seizure of power were a complex interplay of political maneuvering, military intimidation, and public persuasion, all orchestrated by Napoleon and his allies. The materials used were not weapons of mass destruction, but rather carefully placed troops, manipulated legislative sessions, and public declarations designed to legitimize his actions. The labor organization of the coup was a tightly knit conspiracy of ambitious politicians and loyal military officers. The challenges were immense, requiring him to outwit established political figures and rally public opinion to his cause.
Following the coup, Napoleon established the consulate, effectively placing himself at the head of the French government as first consul. This transition marked a significant shift from the collective leadership of the Directory to a more centralized, albeit initially disguised, authoritarian rule. The technical processes of governing now involved consolidating his authority, reforming the administration, and restoring economic stability. He brought order to the chaotic financial system by establishing the Bank of France and stabilizing the currency, actions that were widely welcomed by a population weary of uncertainty. The materials for this new era included the existing governmental structures, which he systematically reshaped, and the immense goodwill he had cultivated through his military successes and promises of stability. This era of transition, from the faltering Directory to the emerging power of Napoleon, demonstrated a fundamental truth about periods of upheaval: that a strong military leader, adept at both warfare and the art of public perception, can indeed rise from the chaos to reshape a nation. The inherent weaknesses of the preceding governmental labor organization and the systematic issues within the French economy created the fertile ground for such a transformation. The challenges of rebuilding a nation after years of revolution and war were immense, but Napoleon's methodical approach, combining military discipline with astute political maneuvering, laid the groundwork for a new chapter in French history. This investigation illuminates broader forces that shape societies. The first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte, found himself amidst the remnants of a revolution, a nation weary of upheaval yet still potent with its ideals. His immediate concern was to stabilize a France that had lurched from radicalism to a precarious republic, and the consolidation of his own authority was paramount. He understood that enduring change required more than military victories. It demanded the rebuilding of institutions, the creation of a predictable legal framework, and the restoration of a functioning economy. This era, often called the Consulate, marked a deliberate effort to impose order upon the revolutionary whirlwind, carefully selecting and codifying the achievements of the past decade while discarding its excesses.
Bonaparte's approach to governance was systematic, an intricate process of reconstruction built upon the very foundations the revolution had simultaneously shattered and laid bare. He established a centralized administrative system, replacing the often chaotic departmental governance of the Directory with prefects appointed by the first consul, direct representatives of his will in every region of France. This required careful selection of individuals, a labor organization focused on loyalty and competence rather than revolutionary pedigree, and the careful management of the materials of governance: the existing bureaucracy, the newly acquired national property, and the loyalty of the citizenry. The challenge lay in instilling a sense of national unity after years of factional strife. A crucial aspect of this consolidation involved financial reform, a perennial problem that had plagued the monarchy and continued to vex successive revolutionary governments. Napoleon understood that a stable currency and a reliable revenue stream were essential to national strength and his own legitimacy. He reintroduced a degree of order into the treasury, establishing the Bank of France in 1800, a carefully orchestrated technical process designed to manage national debt, issue currency, and provide a stable financial anchor. The materials used for this included the old financial records, new accounting methods, and the confidence of merchants and investors, which he worked tirelessly to secure through predictable policies. This period also saw a conscious effort to pacify the populace and end the internal rebellions, particularly in the Vendée region, which had been a hotbed of counter-revolutionary activity. Negotiations and a combination of military pressure and amnesty offers were employed, a calculated labor organization aimed at reintegrating former enemies of the Republic into the national fabric. The materials for reconciliation were the carefully worded decrees, the promises of religious freedom, though carefully managed, and the appeals to national unity. The challenge was immense: to overcome deep-seated resentments and fears without alienating the core supporters of the revolution.
Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the consulate, and a testament to Bonaparte's systematic vision, was the creation of the Napoleonic Code, officially promulgated in 1804. This monumental undertaking involved a meticulous review and codification of French law, drawing from Roman law, customary law, and the decrees of the Revolution. The technical processes of drafting, debating, and revising these legal texts were extensive, involving jurists and legal scholars tasked with creating a unified, coherent, and accessible legal system. The materials were centuries of legal precedent, revolutionary legislation, and the very concept of civil equality, which Bonaparte championed. The code sought to ensure equality before the law, protect property rights, and establish clear rules for civil life, from marriage and inheritance to contracts and property ownership. This represented a significant shift in the labor organization of the legal system itself, moving from a patchwork of regional laws and arbitrary judgments to a standardized framework. The challenges included harmonizing diverse legal traditions and ensuring the code's principles were applied consistently across the vast territory of France. The goal was to create a predictable legal environment that would foster economic activity and social stability. The implementation of the code was not merely an administrative act, it was a profound societal restructuring that aimed to solidify the gains of the revolution while imposing a new form of order. It reflected a pragmatic understanding that revolutionary fervor without institutional grounding could dissolve into chaos. Bonaparte's vision was to channel the revolutionary energy into productive endeavors, and the code provided the legal scaffolding for this endeavor. This requires a careful examination of how legal frameworks shape the daily lives and interactions of people, a lesson that remains remarkably relevant in how laws create both freedom and constraint. The process of creating the code involved extensive debate among a commission of jurists, including figures like Jean-Jacques Cambacérès, a prominent lawyer and statesman who had served in previous revolutionary governments. Their task was to synthesize the various legal traditions into a single, coherent document. The materials they worked with were the existing legal manuscripts, the revolutionary decrees, and the very principles of reason and clarity that the Enlightenment had championed. This intellectual labor, undertaken with a sense of national purpose, aimed to create a legal system that would endure. The debates within the commission were reportedly spirited, with disagreements arising over the extent to which revolutionary principles should be incorporated and how to reconcile them with traditional legal concepts. For instance, discussions around family law, particularly the rights of women and children, reveal the underlying tensions between the revolutionary emphasis on individual rights and more traditional patriarchal structures. The organization of this intellectual labor, therefore, was not simply about compiling laws, but about shaping the very social fabric of France for generations to come. One of the key principles enshrined in the Napoleonic Code was the protection of private property, a direct response to the dismantling of feudal privileges and the redistribution of land during the Revolution. This aspect of the code was particularly appealing to the new class of landowners, who had acquired nationalized church and émigré property. The materials of economic stability, therefore, were directly linked to the security of these property rights, and the code served as a powerful guarantor of that security, fostering investment and economic growth. Moreover, the code addressed matters of civil status, defining marriage as a civil contract, and introducing divorce, albeit with certain restrictions. This marked a significant departure from the ecclesiastical control over family life that had characterized the Ancien Régime. The technical processes involved in registering births, marriages, and deaths were centralized, creating a more efficient and uniform system of civil record-keeping, which itself was a new form of labor organization in the management of the citizenry. The code's influence extended far beyond France's borders, serving as a model for legal systems in many other countries, a testament to its clarity and comprehensiveness. This reach demonstrates the power of codified legal thought to transcend national boundaries, shaping governance and individual rights across diverse cultures. The intellectual labor invested in its creation, therefore, had a truly global impact, influencing legal development for over a century. The Consulate and the Napoleonic Code represent a critical juncture where the revolutionary impulse for change was channeled into a structured, codified system. This transition highlights the enduring challenge of balancing liberty with order, a fundamental question for any society attempting to reform itself. The code exemplifies how a determined leader and a well-organized body of experts can harness the energy of societal transformation to create lasting legal and social structures.
Bonaparte's ascent, from general to first consul, and his subsequent efforts to stabilize and reform France illustrate a profound understanding of how power is consolidated through institutional means. The creation of the Napoleonic Code, in particular, was not merely an administrative act, but a fundamental reimagining of French society, built on a foundation of codified principles that would shape the nation for generations. The careful construction of this legal framework reflects a deliberate process of state-building, drawing upon both revolutionary ideals and established legal traditions. The orderly arrangement of legal texts into a unified system demonstrated a desire to provide a predictable structure for the lives of ordinary citizens. The legal instruments employed, the meticulous drafting sessions, and the ultimate promulgation of this comprehensive legal document represent a significant transformation in the organization of French governance and social relations. As the shadows lengthen, let us drift away from the turbulent streets of Paris, from the storming of the Bastille that sparked an era, to the chilling whispers of the Reign of Terror. Imagine the quietude that followed the clamor, the uncertainty that settled after the monarchy's fall, and the determined stride of a new leader emerging from the upheaval. Think of the revolutionaries, their hopes and fears, their courage and their despair, as they navigated these extraordinary times. Now, as we conclude this glimpse into the French Revolution, from the initial fervor to the eventual rise of Bonaparte, allow these reflections to settle like fine dust, calming your spirit. May the quiet hum of history's progress lull you into a deep and peaceful slumber. Rest now with the assurance that even in the most tumultuous periods, the world finds its way to dawn. Sleep soundly.